In April 1985, a Buckingham Palace spokesman stood before the British press and delivered two sentences that should not be able to exist in the same statement. The first sentence, Princess Michael confirmed tonight that it is true that her father was a member of the SS. The second sentence, immediately following, it came as a total surprise to her when she heard the news, and it came as a total shock. Read those two sentences again. She confirmed it, and she was also totally surprised by it. She knew enough to confirm the story the Daily Mirror had just published. She also, simultaneously, had no idea the story was true. The Daily Mirror described this statement as unbelievable. They were being polite. The historian Philip Hall had found the evidence at the Berlin Documentation Center years before the Mirror published anything. He found that Baron Günther von Reibnitz, Princess Michael's father, had joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and the SS in 1933. He rose to the rank of major. He obtained his SS position on the recommendation of Hermann Göring, Adolf Hitler's right-hand man. Hall had found all of this while researching a book about the royal family. He said afterward, "It struck me that someone was covering something up. The royal family had vetted Marie-Christine von Reibnitz before allowing Prince Michael to marry her in 1978. They vetted every potential spouse. This was not optional. This was the institution." And genealogists who examined the process afterward were explicit. The royal family had almost certainly found what Hall found. They had found the SS files. They had found the Nazi Party membership. They had found the Göring connection. And they had approved the marriage anyway. 7 years later, when the Mirror published the files, the palace produced the statement about the total surprise and the total shock. And in doing so, the palace produced the statement that the palace had been managing this marriage's most dangerous secret since before the marriage began. That was one secret. There were others. There was the matter of the Kensington Palace apartment the couple lived in for decades. The palace told the public they received no public funding. They were not working royals. They supported themselves. The House of Commons eventually discovered they were paying £69 per week in rent. The Queen was quietly covering the difference herself, £120,000 per year from her private funds, while the palace maintained the fiction of the independent couple managing without institutional support. There was the matter of Prince Michael's business operations. In 2021, Channel 4 and the Sunday Times sent undercover reporters posing as South Korean gold investors to meet him. He offered them his royal endorsement for $200,000 and his Kensington Palace home as a backdrop to impress clients. His business partner, the Marquis of Reading, explained the arrangement to the undercover reporters. "We wouldn't want the world to know that he is seeing Putin purely for business reasons, if you follow me." Princess Michael had her own contributions to the marriage's public record. There was the 2004 incident in a New York restaurant, where she was accused of telling a group of black diners to go back to the colonies. There was the 2017 Christmas lunch where she arrived to meet Meghan Markle wearing a blackamoor brooch, a stylized image of a black man's head, and later apologized for causing offense. There were the two black sheep she kept at her country property, which she had named Venus and Serena. She once told an interviewer, "I have more royal blood than any other bride or bridegroom who has married into the royal family since Prince Philip." Her nickname in the British press was Princess Pushy. This is the marriage that the palace approved. The SS files and the Catholic divorce, and the succession rights waiver, and the publicly funded private life, and the Putin-access fees, and the blackamoor brooch, and the colony's remark, and the sheep, named after the Williams sisters. The palace looked at all of it across 47 years of this marriage and produced the specific institutional response it always produces when the thing it is managing is the thing it cannot unmanage, which is the response of the total surprise and the total shock, and the statement that the palace is paying no attention to any of this from its private funds. What the palace was actually managing and what the managing produced is what this account examines. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I love hearing from you. Prince Michael of Kent was born on the 4th of July 1942 at Coppins, the Kent family's country house in Iver, Buckinghamshire. and the specific date of his birth is the first of the biographical details that organizes his position in the royal family's internal geography. Because the 4th of July 1942 was a Wednesday in the middle of the Second World War, and it was also the birthday of the American Republic, and Prince Michael of Kent would spend a significant portion of his subsequent adult life deploying his fluent Russian and his royal name in the service of commercial relationships with the Russian state, which is the specific biographical irony that the 4th of July birthday does not predict, and that the subsequent decades produced regardless. He was the third child of Prince George, Duke of Kent, and Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. The Duke of Kent was the fourth son of King George V, which made him the younger brother of Kings Edward the Fair and George VI, and the first cousin of the Duke of Windsor, who had abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, in the specific act of institutional disruption that the family had spent the subsequent decades managing in the direction of the managed. Prince George had been the glamorous Kent, the brother whose specific combination of the good-looking and the socially connected had made him the royal of the 1930s, whose presence in the social world of the decade had generated the specific variety of the coverage that the glamorous royal generates. He had also been the royal of the 1930s, whose private life had generated the specific variety of the coverage that the private life of the glamorous royal generates when the private life has been conducted in the directions that the 1930s social world of the glamorous royal conducted itself in, which were the directions of the bisexual relationships and the drug use and the specific variety of the personal conduct that the palace had been managing since before his marriage to Marina in 1934. Prince George died in August 1942, 6 weeks after Michael's birth, in an air crash near Dunbeath in Caithness, Scotland, when the short Sunderland flying boat he was travelling in struck the hillside of Eagles Rock in conditions of low cloud and poor visibility. He was 39 years old. The crash killed 14 of the 15 people aboard. Michael was 6 weeks old when his father died, which made him, in the specific biographical condition of the 6-week-old who loses a parent, the child whose formation would be the formation without the father, in the specific institutional context of the royal family's management of the widow and the children of the dead duke. The institutional context's management of the widow and the children produced the management of Princess Marina as the Dowager Duchess of Kent, which was the specific institutional designation of the woman whose husband's death had converted her from the active dimension of the royal family's operational social world to the commemorative dimension, the position of the woman who was kept in the royal family's social world by the specific virtue of the title she had held as the wife of the man who had held the title, rather than by any continuing institutional function of her own. Marina managed the management with the specific quality of someone who had arrived in the British royal family from the Greek royal family in the specific period of the Greek royal family's most complete displacement, and who had therefore learned from the formation the specific management of the institutional displacement as the available condition rather than the extraordinary one. Michael grew up at Coppins and at Kensington Palace, and in the specific social environment of the royal family's extended household in the post-war period, which was the environment of the people who were inside the institution, and who were simultaneously the people for whom the institution's primary operational requirements were the requirements of the people at the institution's center, rather than the requirements of the people at the institution's edge. Prince Michael was at the institution's edge. He was the younger brother of Edward, Duke of Kent, and Princess Alexandra, and the younger brother was the younger brother in the institution that organized its primary attention around the heir rather than the spare, and that organized its secondary attention around the daughter rather than the second son. The position at the institution's edge was the position of the person who was genuinely royal in the sense of the blood and the title and the social world and the formation and the membership in the most prominent family in the United Kingdom, and who was simultaneously the person for whom the institution's primary functions and the institution's primary resources were not organized. He was not in the line of succession in any practical sense. He was 15th in 1978 when he married, which was the 15th of a line of succession that required the death of 14 people before the 15th became relevant to the succession's operational requirements, and the 15 included the people whose proximity to the throne was the proximity of the working royal, rather than the proximity of the peripheral member. He was educated at Eton, which was the education that the royal family's male members received as the standard formation of the English aristocratic male's institutional preparation for the public life that the formation was designed to produce, and at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, which was the military formation that the royal male's expected military career required to be preceded by the educational formation that Sandhurst provided. The combination of Eton and Sandhurst was the combination of the standard royal male formation of the period, and the formation produced in Michael, the specific qualities that the formation was designed to produce, which were the qualities of the officer class, and the gentleman, and the person whose social ease in the institutional environments of the upper class was the social ease of someone who had been formed inside those environments, rather than the social ease of someone who had acquired it from outside. He served in the army for 20 years. The service was the service of the person who had identified in the military the available form of the institutional role that his position in the royal family's hierarchy did not otherwise provide. And the military role was the role that the royal family's male members' expected service in the armed forces had established as the available form for the person who was royal enough to serve in the officer class and insufficiently central to the succession to require the specific preparation for the institutional role that the heir's formation required. He served in Germany and in Hong Kong and in Cyprus, in the specific postings of the military career of the period that the Cold War's specific geography had organized, and the service was the service of the person who was doing the military career rather than performing the royal function. He spoke languages. The languages were the specific quality of his formation that distinguished him from the standard product of the Eton and Sandhurst formation, because the standard product of the Eton and Sandhurst formation of the period was the product of the English-speaking world's specific educational culture, which was the culture that had organized itself around the English language as the sufficient language, and that had produced in its graduates the specific quality of the monolingual that the English educational culture of the period considered adequate. Michael spoke French and German and Russian, which was the combination of languages that the royal family's German connections and the Cold War's specific geography had produced in someone who had been paying attention to the formation's implications rather than merely receiving the formation's standard product. The Russian was the specific language that the subsequent decades would make the most consequential. He had learned it in the military, in the specific context of the military intelligence requirements of the Cold War, that had organized the British Army's interest in the Russian-speaking capability among its officers. And the learning had been the learning of someone who had identified in the Russian the available form of the specific asset that the peripheral royal's position in the institutional hierarchy required to develop if the position was going to be the position of the person who had something to offer, rather than merely the position of the person who was royal and insufficient. The something to offer was the combination of the royal name and the Russian language, and the specific social ease of the institutional insider, who was simultaneously an institutional peripheral, and the combination was the combination that the subsequent commercial career of Prince Michael of Kent would deploy in the specific directions that the Putin sting of 2021 established as the most publicly documented directions of the deployment. But the commercial career was the career that the military career's retirement in 1981 had made necessary, because the military career's retirement was the retirement of the institutional role that the 20 years had provided, and that the retirement had removed, and the removal had left Michael in the specific position of the former military officer, who was also a peripheral royal, and who had the combination of the royal name and the Russian and the social ease, and no institutional income. The no institutional income was the specific condition that the peripheral royal's position in the institutional hierarchy produced for the person at the edge of the institution rather than the center, because the center provided the civil list and the official duties and the institutional support that the official function justified, and the edge provided the title and the social world and the formation and the membership without the institutional support that the official function would have generated if the person had been sufficiently central to the succession to require the official function. He had to find another way. The finding of another way was the specific project of the subsequent decades, and the finding produced the commercial consultancy and the Russian connections and the management company and the specific commercial deployments of the royal name and the Kremlin-access and the Kensington Palace address as the backdrop for the investment pitch that the 2021 sting had documented. The finding had also produced, several years before the commercial career's beginning, the marriage that this account's title identified as the cover story the palace wrote together. The marriage required a woman, the woman required finding. The finding produced Marie-Christine von Reibnitz, who was in London in the early 1970s, having arrived from the specific trajectory that the account's subsequent parts examine, and who was in the specific position of the person who was simultaneously the divorced Catholic baroness of Central European aristocratic descent, and the person whose specific combination of the European social intelligence and the physical presence and the cultural formation had made her the person in the room that the people in the room noticed. Prince Michael noticed her in 1973. The noticing was the beginning of the 5-year courtship that the marriage's institutional complications required before the marriage could be the marriage. Baroness Marie-Christine Anna Agnes Hedwig Ida von Reibnitz was born on the 15th of January 1945 in Tachau, which was then part of the Greater German Reich and which is now the Czech town of Takov, and the specific circumstances of her birth were the circumstances of a family in the specific condition of the families of the German-speaking aristocracy in January 1945, which was the condition of the family whose world was ending around them in the form of the Soviet advance from the east and the Allied advance from the west, and the specific quality of the collapse that the total war's total defeat produces in the people who are inside the collapsing world rather than observing it from outside. Her mother, Countess Maria Anna Schapari von Murasombach, had just been released from a Nazi prison camp on the day of Marie-Christine's birth. The Countess had been arrested for participating in an anti-Nazi demonstration, which was the specific act of resistance that the Nazi state's management of the dissent within its own aristocratic class had produced the specific consequence for, which was the imprisonment of the person who had demonstrated and the demonstration of the consequence to the other people in the aristocratic class who might otherwise have been considering the demonstration. The arrest had been the arrest of someone who was married to a member of the SS, which was the specific biographical irony that the Reibnitz family's situation in January 1945 embodied, which was the irony of the wife who had been imprisoned for opposing the regime that her husband had been serving. Her father, Baron Günther von Reibnitz, was on the day of her birth being held as a prisoner of war. He had joined the Nazi Party in 1930, 3 years before Hitler came to power, which established the specific quality of his commitment to the movement in the terms that the 1930 joining date provides rather than the terms of the 1933 joining date, because the 1933 date was the date that people who had identified the movement's inevitable rise could join without the risk that the 1930 date required. He had joined in 1930, when the risk was still real, which was the evidence of the commitment rather than the calculation. He had joined the SS in 1933, on the recommendation of Hermann Göring, Adolf Hitler's right-hand man and the commander of the Luftwaffe. He had risen to the rank of major, but the relationship between her parents and the specific contradictions of that relationship was more complicated than the simple pairing of a Nazi father and an anti-Nazi mother. Her mother had married him believing his first marriage had been properly dissolved. It had not been. When this became clear, and when her mother's devout Catholicism prevented her from continuing in a marriage that the Church did not recognize as valid, the relationship had broken down. Her father, dismissed from the SS in 1944 for the specific act of declaring his Catholicism over his SS membership, writing to Heinrich Himmler that he would choose the Church over the SS, had already been removed from the organization before the war ended. After the war, he was tried by a Bavarian denazification court in 1947 and classified as a lesser offender, the third of 5 classifications, before appealing and being reclassified as a mere follower. He then left for Africa, first to Mozambique and then through several other countries, acquiring 2 more wives in the process and spending the remainder of his life at a considerable distance from the daughter whose marriage to the Queen's first cousin would eventually require the palace to produce the statement about the total surprise and the total shock. Marie-Christine grew up without him. The growing up without him was the growing up of the specific condition that the post-war Central European aristocratic family's displacement produced in the children who were the children of the displaced, which was the formation of someone who understood from childhood that the world that had organized the formation was not the world that the formation would be conducted in, because the world that had organized the formation had been the world of the German-speaking Central European aristocracy, and that world had ended in 1945, and what had replaced it was the world of the displaced and the stateless, and the people who were managing the possession of the title without the territory, and the social position without the social world that the position had been organized around inhabiting. Her mother took her and her older brother Friedrich to Australia. The Australia of the late 1940s and early 1950s was the Australia that the European immigration of the post-war period was producing, the country that was receiving the people whom the European war had displaced and who were finding in the specific geography of the Southern Hemisphere the available alternative to the European geography, whose political organization had been converted by the war into the specific configuration that made the European geography unavailable for the people whose position in the pre-war European geography the war had removed. Sydney was the city. The mother had identified in Sydney the available location for the reconstruction of the life that the war had removed, and the reconstruction was the reconstruction of someone who was managing the Central European aristocratic formation in the Australian context, which was the management of the person who has the specific social intelligence of the European aristocrat and who is deploying that intelligence in the environment of the post-war Australian social world. The mother eventually remarried a Polish nobleman, which was the specific form of the reconstruction that the Central European aristocrats' management of the displacement produced when the reconstruction required the partner whose formation matched the formation rather than the partner whose available context had generated the partnership. Marie-Christine was educated in this environment and in the subsequent environments that the mother's management of the available options produced across the childhood and adolescence that followed. The education was the education of the person who was moving through the available environments, rather than the person who was stationary inside the established environment, which was the education that produces the specific quality of the social adaptability of the person who has been required to read and manage the successive available environments, rather than the single stable one. She attended schools in Austria and Australia, and lived in Mozambique, where her father had settled, in the period that the accounts of her childhood describe as the period of the contact with the father rather than the period of the formation, because the formation was the mother's formation rather than the father's. She arrived in London in her early 20s. The London she arrived in was the London of the early 1970s, which was the London of the specific social world that the combination of the old money and the new opportunity and the specifically international dimension of the city's social elite had produced in the post-war decades, and the social world was the social world that the Central European aristocratic formation was equipped to navigate in the specific ways that the formation had developed. She enrolled at the Victoria and Albert Museum to study the history of fine and decorative art, which was the specific course of study that the formation had identified as the appropriate intellectual engagement for someone whose background in the European aristocratic culture's relationship to the decorative and the historical had produced the specific interest that the course was organized around developing. The Victoria and Albert Museum's course of study produced in her the specific combination of the intellectual formation and the social world that the London of the early 1970s made available to the person who was studying the decorative arts at one of London's most significant cultural institutions, and the social world was the social world of the European aristocratic exiles and the English upper class, and the specific overlap between the two that the London of the period had produced as the available social environment. She moved through this social world with the specific quality of the person who had been reading and managing the available social environments since the displacement of 1945, and who had developed from the reading and the managing the specific social intelligence that the formation had always been building toward. She was also, by the accounts of the people who encountered her in London in those years, a woman of considerable physical presence, the tall blonde of the Central European aristocratic type, the specific combination of the bearing and the appearance that the formation of the person who has grown up inside the European aristocratic world produces in the people it produces, was the specific physical presence that she brought to the London social world of the early 1970s, alongside the social intelligence and the decorative arts formation, and the specific quality of the person who understood that she was operating in a social world that had resources she intended to access. The first marriage was to Thomas Troubridge. The marriage took place in September 1971, when she was 26 years old, and Thomas Troubridge was an English merchant banker, the son of a baronet, whose social world was the social world of the English upper class that the London social environment of the early 1970s had made available to the person of her formation and appearance and social intelligence. The marriage was the marriage of two people who occupied adjacent positions in the social world that the London of the early 1970s had organized, and whose adjacent positions had produced the proximity that the marriage required. The marriage did not last. The accounts of its ending have been preserved in the biographical record in the form of the available information about the marriages that end, rather than the marriages that continue, which was the form of the known endpoint rather than the documented interior, and the known endpoint was the endpoint of the annulment that the Catholic Church granted in 1978, in the specific month before the marriage to Prince Michael of Kent, that the annulment was organized around making possible. The annulment was the specific instrument of the Catholic Church's management of the marriage's end, in the form that the Catholic Church's law provides, when the marriage has been determined to have been invalid from the beginning, rather than valid and subsequently dissolved, and the determination of the invalidity was the determination that the papal dispensation had produced from the specific circumstances of the marriage's beginning that the annulment process had examined. She had been in London for approximately 2 years when she encountered Prince Michael of Kent for the first time in 1973, and the encounter was the encounter that the London social world of the people whose formation had placed them in adjacent positions in the available social environment produces, which was the encounter of the person who was in the room and the person who was also in the room, and whose being in the same room the social world's management of the available rooms had organized. Prince Michael was 31 years old in 1973. Marie-Christine was 28. He was in the military, which was the institutional role that the military career of the next 8 years would continue to provide. She was in the process of the Troubridge marriage's dissolution and the London social world's navigation that the dissolution required her to conduct. They were in the room. They noticed each other. The noticing was the beginning of the 5 years of the courtship that the institutional complications of the marriage required before the marriage could occur, and the institutional complications were the complications that the palace's assessment of the available bride had produced, in the form of the complications that the palace's assessment of every available bride produced when the available bride was the bride of someone in the royal family's membership. The assessment was thorough. The assessment's thoroughness was the thoroughness that the palace applied to every potential marriage partner in the royal family's social world, and the thoroughness was organized around the specific dimensions of the potential partner's background that the palace had determined were the dimensions relevant to the institutional management of the marriage's implications for the family's public image and the family's internal stability, and the family's relationship to the political and the historical record that the partner's background would add to the family's own political and historical record. The assessment found several complications. The Catholic faith was a complication in the specific form that the Act of Settlement of 1701 produced for the marriage of a member of the royal family to a Catholic, which was the complication of the succession rights that the marriage required to be waived before the marriage could proceed. The divorce was a complication in the specific form that the royal family's management of its members' marriages had organized itself around managing, since the abdication had established the specific precedent of what the management of a divorced royal consort cost the institution. And the background was a complication in the specific form that the palace's inquiry into the background had produced, which was the form of the SS Major, whose files were in the Berlin Documentation Center, and whose files the palace's inquiry had been organized around examining. What the palace found in the files and what the palace decided to do with what it found, is the question whose answer the 1985 Daily Mirror revelation and Philip Hall's subsequent statement about the covering up were organized around establishing in the public record. The finding and the deciding are what the next part of this account examines. The 5 years between the 1973 meeting and the 1978 marriage were not 5 years of the ordinary courtship that the ordinary engagement produces in the people who have decided they want to marry and who are managing the practical arrangements of the marriage rather than the institutional obstacles of the institution that the marriage requires to approve it. They were 5 years of the institutional management of the obstacles that the palace had identified in the assessment of the potential marriage partner, and that the palace was required to determine whether the management of the obstacles was the management that would produce the approved marriage, or the management that would produce the institutional conclusion that the obstacles were not manageable in the form of the approved marriage. The obstacles were 3. The Catholic faith was the first obstacle, and the most formally documented, because the Act of Settlement of 1701 was the legal instrument that had organized the obstacle in the form of the specific statutory provision that prohibited the person who married a Catholic from succeeding to the throne. And the prohibition was the prohibition that required Prince Michael to renounce his succession rights before the marriage could proceed. The renunciation was not the renunciation of the person who was renouncing a practically significant claim, because the 15th position in the line of succession was not the position whose holder the institution was organizing its primary institutional management around, but it was the renunciation of the formal membership in the succession that the formal membership represented, and the formal renunciation of the formal membership was the institutional act that the statute required. The divorce was the second obstacle, and the obstacle that the royal family's specific history had organized the most significant available precedent around, which was the precedent of the abdication of 1936, and the specific institutional consequence that the abdication had established as the consequence of the royal family member's marriage to the divorced person, which was the consequence of the institutional crisis that the managing of the marriage to the divorced person had required the institution to manage across the decades following the abdication. The abdication's precedent was the precedent that the palace's management of the divorce obstacle in the Marie-Christine case was organized around not reproducing, because the precedent was the precedent of the thing that the institution had decided was the most expensive available consequence of the royal marriage to the divorced person, and that the institution was organized around not reproducing in subsequent cases. The third obstacle was the background. The background was the obstacle that the palace's inquiry into the background had produced in the form of the files at the Berlin Documentation Center that Philip Hall would subsequently describe as the files that struck him as the evidence that someone was covering something up. And the files were the files of Baron Günther von Reibnitz, the SS major who had joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and the SS in 1933, on the recommendation of Hermann Göring, and who had risen to the rank of major before being dismissed for declaring his Catholicism over his SS membership. The genealogists and historians who examined the palace's vetting process in the aftermath of the 1985 Daily Mirror revelation were explicit about what the vetting would have found. Harold Brooks Baker of Burke's Peerage, speaking to the press in the days following the Mirror story, described the royal family as having certainly inquired into the background of the von Reibnitz family. He said they had kept quiet, he believed, for fear of a scandal. The phrasing was the phrasing of someone who was describing the palace's management of the information in the specific form of the management that produces the silence rather than the disclosure, and the silence was the silence that the 7 years between the 1978 wedding and the 1985 revelation had maintained until the Daily Mirror had ended the maintenance. The palace's management of the background obstacle was therefore the management of the decision to approve the marriage, despite the background, rather than the management of the decision to investigate the background and produce the transparent account of what the investigation found. The investigation had found the SS files. The investigation had found the Göring connection. The investigation had found the major's rank and the Nazi Party membership from 1930. And the palace had decided that the finding of those things was not the finding that required the public disclosure or the denial of the marriage's approval, but the finding that required the specific management of the information in the form of the silence, that the management of inconvenient institutional information always produces when the institution has decided that the silence is the management option whose cost is lower than the disclosure's cost. The cost calculation that produced the silence was the cost calculation of the institution that was weighing the cost of the SS officer in the background of the Queen's first cousin's wife against the cost of the alternative, which was the alternative of the denial of the marriage's approval. The denial of the marriage's approval was the cost of the management of Prince Michael's position in the specific form of the unmated peripheral royal, whose position in the institutional hierarchy was the position that the institution was not providing the institutional support for, and that the marriage to Marie Christine was providing the specific human dimension of that the institutional support was not providing. Lord Mountbatten was the intermediary. He was Prince Philip's uncle, and a distant relation of the monarch, and his role in securing the Queen's blessing for the marriage was the role of the person whose position in the royal family's internal social world gave him the specific access to the Queen's assessment of the situation that the intermediary's function requires. He had been deployed in this capacity before, in the management of other institutional complications in the royal family's marriage arrangements, and the deployment in the Michael and Marie Christine case was the deployment of someone who understood what the Queen's reservations were, and who was organized around addressing the reservations in the direction of the approval. The Queen had reservations. The reservations were the reservations about the Catholic faith and the divorce, which were the two obstacles that the formal institutional framework had organized the reservations around, and the reservations were the reservations of the head of the Church of England about the marriage of her cousin to a Catholic divorcee, in the specific context of the Act of Settlement and the abdications precedent. The Queen was the supreme governor of the Church of England by the constitutional settlement that the Church's relationship to the Crown had established, and the supreme governor of the Church of England had the specific institutional position that made the approval of the marriage of the Queen's cousin to a Catholic divorcee the approval of the supreme governor, rather than merely the approval of the family matriarch. Mountbatten managed the reservations. The managing produced the approval, in the form that the approval eventually took, which was the approval that required the renunciation of the succession rights and the papal annulment of the first marriage and the civil ceremony in Vienna, rather than the Church of England ceremony in London, that the religious constraints of the marriage's specific character had made unavailable. The civil ceremony in Vienna on the 30th of June 1978 was the ceremony that the institutional management of the marriage's religious constraints had organized as the available form of the ceremony, because Vienna was the city outside the United Kingdom's jurisdiction where the civil ceremony could be conducted without the specific implications of the Church of England ceremony in London that the Supreme Governor of the Church of England's approval of the ceremony in London would have implied. The Vienna ceremony was also the ceremony that was not the London ceremony, and the not the London ceremony quality of the Vienna ceremony was the quality that established the institutional distance between the marriage and the institution's most visible endorsement of the marriage, because the most visible endorsement would have been the ceremony in London, with the family present, and the coverage that the family's presence at the London ceremony would have generated, and the Vienna civil ceremony, with the civil format and the non-London geography, was the ceremony that the institutional management of the distance between the marriage and the most visible endorsement had produced as the available alternative. The papal annulment of the Trowbridge marriage had been granted in the weeks before the Vienna ceremony, in the specific month of the ceremony's arrangement that the annulment process had been organized to produce the completion in, and the completion produced the availability of the Catholic marriage's sacramental validity that the annulment's completion provided, which was the availability that the civil ceremony's religious complement required to be available before the civil ceremony produced the marriage in the form that both the civil and the religious dimensions of the marriage required. Prince Michael was 35 years old at the ceremony. Marie Christine was 33. She received the title of Princess Michael of Kent, which was the specific form of the title that the royal family's protocol for the naming of the wives of the male members of the family produced in the case of the wife, whose own name the title system replaced with the husband's name and title, rather than with the wife's own name. and the Princess Michael formulation was the formulation that replaced Marie-Christine von Reibnitz with the designation of the wife of the prince, whose name she now bore, rather than the person whose own name and history the designation was covering. The covering of the name was the covering of the person, and the covering of the person in the specific form of the title that replaced the person's own name with the husband's was the covering that the royal family's protocol produced as the standard outcome of the marriage of a woman into the family, rather than the specific management of this particular woman's particular background. But the covering produced the specific effect in this specific case of the institutional management's most useful available instrument, which was the instrument of the title that converted the Central European Baroness with the SS officer father and the failed first marriage and the papal annulment and the Czech birthplace and the Australian childhood and the London social world navigation into the princess, whose designation was the designation of the institution's membership rather than the designation of the person's own formation. The institution's membership designation was Princess Michael of Kent. The person's own formation designation was Baroness Marie-Christine Anna Agnes Hedwig Ida von Reibnitz, daughter of the SS Major, born in what was then the Greater German Reich, whose father had fled to Africa and whose mother had been imprisoned for opposing the regime the father had served. The two designations coexisted in the same person from the 30th of June 1978, and the institution's management of the marriage's public presentation was organized around the first designation rather than the second, and the organization produced the cover story that the palace had written for the marriage in the form of the princess and the prince, and the civil ceremony in Vienna, and the papers that covered the ceremony and that did not include the background file from the Berlin Documentation Center that Philip Hall had found, and that struck him as the evidence that someone was covering something up. The covering was proceeding smoothly. The SS files were in the Berlin Documentation Center. The palace knew about them. The palace had decided they were manageable. The Daily Mirror had not yet found them. The marriage that the cover story covered was now underway, and the underway required the management of the subsequent years, which were the years that the management was organized around the production of the Princess Michael of Kent, who was the princess rather than the baroness. And the production was the production of the cover story's continuation in the form of the person who was performing the cover story's subject, rather than the person whose background the cover story was organized around not performing. She was very good at performing the cover story's subject. The performing was the performing of someone who had been performing the management of the available social environments since the displacement of 1945, and who understood that the available environment was now the environment of the British royal family's social world, and that the available environment required the performance of the person who was in the available environment rather than the performance of the person who was managing the available environment from outside it. The performance was called Princess Michael of Kent. It was also called Princess Pushy. The gap between the two names is where the story actually lives. The nickname arrived before the decade was out. Princess Pushy was not the nickname that the palace's communications operation had designed for the woman it had approved to join the institution in the Vienna civil ceremony of June 1978, because the palace's communications operation does not design nicknames for the people it approves to join the institution. The palace's communications operation designs the coverage. The coverage produces the public image. The public image produces the person that the public receives as the person the institution has presented. The nickname is what the public produces when the public has received the presented person and has identified, in the gap between the presented person and the person the coverage is organized around not presenting, the quality that the gap contains and that the nickname names. Princess Pushy named the quality that the gap contained. The gap was the gap between Princess Michael of Kent, the designation of the institution's membership, and the person whose membership the designation was organized around designating, and the quality that the gap contained was the quality of the person who was simultaneously a member of the institution and not the person that the institution's standard management of its members' public presentation produced. Because the standard management produced the people who performed the institutional membership in the specific register of the performed institutional membership, and Princess Michael was performing the institutional membership in a different register, which was the register of the person who was conscious of the performing and who was deploying the performing in the direction of the institutional position's maximization rather than the institutional position's maintenance. The maximization was the specific quality that the pushy named. The pushiness was not the pushiness of the person who was simply more assertive than the institutional environment preferred, because the institutional environment of the British royal family contained people of considerable assertiveness, and the assertiveness alone was not the quality that required the nickname's specific register. The pushiness was the pushiness of the person who was maximizing the institutional position's available returns in the specific directions that the maximization required, which were the directions of the social prominence and the institutional recognition and the specific variety of the royal visibility that the person at the institution's edge requires to manufacture rather than inheriting from the position at the institution's center. She was not at the institution's center, she was at the institution's edge, in the specific position of the wife of the Queen's first cousin, who was not a working royal, in the sense of the institution's management of the working royal's functions and resources, and the edge position was the position that required the active management of the visibility that the center position provides automatically. The automatic visibility of the center position is the visibility of the heir and the monarch, and the people whose proximity to the succession organizes the public's attention around them, regardless of the specific activities they are undertaking. And the manufactured visibility of the edge position is the visibility of the person who must produce the occasion for the public's attention, rather than relying on the position's inherent occasion production. Princess Michael produced the occasions. The producing was the producing of the person who had understood from the beginning of the marriage's public dimension that the edge position's visibility required the active production rather than the passive receipt, and the active production was the active production of the social occasions and the public engagements and the specific variety of the presence that the visibility required to be maintained. She attended events, she organized events, she was present at the social occasions that the royal family's social calendar generated, and at the social occasions that the social world adjacent to the royal family's social calendar generated, and she was present with the specific quality of the presence that the person who is manufacturing the visibility, rather than inheriting it, brings to the occasion of the presence. The presence was formidable. The accounts of people who encountered Princess Michael in the social world of the British upper class in the 1980s and 1990s described the specific quality of the formidability in the terms that the formidable presence produces in the people who encounter it, which were the terms of the tall and the assured and the specifically aristocratic bearing that the Central European formation had produced in her, and that she deployed in the social occasions, with the efficiency of someone who understood that the bearing was the instrument of the manufactured visibility, and who was using the instrument in the direction of the visibility's production. She was, by several accounts of the period, the most immediately visible person in the room at the social occasions where she was present, which was the visibility that the manufacturing had been organized around producing. The Queen found this difficult. The accounts of the relationship between Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Michael of Kent, that the people who were inside the royal family's social world in those years have preserved, describe the specific quality of the difficulty in the terms that the Queen's management of her extended family's members produced when the members were the members, whose management required the specific variety of the management that the unconventional member requires, which was the management of the person who was not performing the institutional membership in the register that the institution's standard management had been producing, and that the institution's management was organized around the production of. The Queen's own description of Princess Michael, preserved in the accounts of the period through the specific channel of Lord Mountbatten's subsequent reporting of the Queen's private assessments to the people with whom Mountbatten shared those assessments, was a description that the accounts have preserved in the form of the characterization rather than the direct quotation, and the characterization was the characterization of the unconventional member in the specific register of the head of the family, whose family includes someone who is not performing the membership in the expected register. The characterization was not warm. The specific assessment that the public record has preserved most completely is the assessment that Princess Michael herself quoted in an interview, in which she described having been told that she was more royal than the royals. The telling was the telling that she attributed to Lord Mountbatten, and the attribution was the attribution of the person who understood that the quote's source was the source that gave the quote its specific weight in the context of the institutional world in which the quote had been produced. She found it amusing. The institution found it less amusing. She also said, in a separate interview, that the press reproduced with the specific attention that the statement warranted, "I have more royal blood than any other bride or bridegroom who has married into the royal family since Prince Philip." The statement was the statement of the person whose Central European aristocratic formation had produced in her the specific understanding of the value of the royal blood in the social economy of the European aristocracy, and who was communicating the understanding in the specific register of the person who has identified the value and is stating the identification rather than managing the identification in the direction of the institutional discretion that the management would require. The institution required the discretion. The institution is always organized around the management of the institutional members' statements about their own positions in the institutional hierarchy, in the direction of the discretion that prevents the explicit statement of the hierarchy from becoming the public performance of the hierarchy's internal tensions. The explicit statement of the royal blood's quantity in comparison to the other brides and bridegrooms was the explicit statement that the institution was organized around preventing, and that Princess Michael had produced in the specific interview that the prevention had failed to prevent. The books were the other available form of the manufacturing of the visibility that the edge position required. She wrote books about European royalty, beginning with Crowned in a Far Country in 1986, which was the book that established the pattern of the subsequent writing career in the form of the insider account of the European royal families. That the person whose formation had placed her at the intersection of the Central European aristocratic world and the British royal family's social world could produce as the specific offering that the person in that position could make to the publishing market for the royal biography and history that the British reading public consumed. The books were genuinely researched and genuinely written, which was the specific quality of the books that the critics who reviewed them noted in the terms of the surprised rather than the expected, because the expected of the royal who writes books about European royalty is the expected of the ghost-written and the superficial, and the Princess Michael books were neither ghost-written nor superficial, and the critics' noting of this was the noting of the quality in the form of the surprise that the expectation had not predicted. She wrote about the crowned heads and the royal houses, and the specific histories of the dynasties that her formation had placed her in proximity to, and the writing was the writing of someone who was deploying the formation's specific knowledge in the direction of the available commercial product. The interior design was the other professional dimension. She described herself as an interior designer, and the interior design work was the work that the Kensington Palace apartment had provided the available showcase for, because the Kensington Palace apartment was the apartment that the institutional arrangement had provided, and that the interior design had converted into the specific expression of the taste and the style that the Central European aristocratic formation had developed in her as the available aesthetic intelligence. The apartment was large, and it was at Kensington Palace, and the interior design was visible to the people who were invited to the apartment and who produced the accounts of the apartment's interior in the terms that the visible aesthetic intelligence of the interior design produces in the people who encounter it. The Kensington Palace apartment was the apartment that was costing £69 per week in rent. The £69 per week was the rent that the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee would discover in 2002, and that the discovering would establish as the specific financial arrangement that the institutional management of the edge positions housing had produced in the form of the managed provision rather than the market provision. The market provision of a Kensington Palace apartment of the scale that Prince and Princess Michael of Kent occupied would have produced the rental figure that the London residential property market of the period would have generated, which was the figure that was considerably in excess of £69 per week, and the £69 per week was the figure that the institutional management had organised the rent around, rather than the market figure. The Queen was paying the difference between the £69 per week that the couple paid and the £120,000 per year that the market rate represented was the difference that the Queen was paying from her private funds in the specific recognition of the royal engagements and the charity work that the couple was undertaking at their own expense, which was the formulation that the palace had produced when the 2002 discovery had required the palace to produce a formulation that explained the arrangement in the terms that the palace's management of the arrangement's public presentation required. The formulation was the formulation of the cover story's continuation in the financial dimension, which was the dimension of the edge position's specific financial arrangement that the cover story required to be managed in the direction of the not publicly funded, rather than the publicly funded, because the publicly funded was the category that the working royal occupied, and the couple had been presented as the not working royals who were managing without the public funding. The managing without the public funding was the managing with the Queen's private funds provision of the £120,000 per year difference between the £69 per week and the market rate, and the provision was the cover story's financial dimension in the specific form of the private, rather than the public, that the cover story required to maintain the distinction between the working royal and the not working royal that the institutional management of the edge position required. Princess Pushy was the name the public had given to the person performing the cover story's subject. The name identified the specific quality of the performance that the cover story's subject's performance had produced in the public's reception of the performance, which was the quality of the maximization of the institutional position's available returns that the cover story's subject had been deploying since the Vienna ceremony of 1978. The maximization had been going on for 5 years when the Daily Mirror found the Berlin Documentation Center files in 1985. The Daily Mirror published the story on the 15th of April 1985. The story was the story of Baron Günther von Reibnitz, who had died 2 years earlier, and what the story established about the Baron was what the Berlin Documentation Center's files had established about the Baron, which was the establishment of the facts whose existence the palace had known since before the 1978 marriage, and whose public absence from the coverage of the marriage had been the specific management achievement that the cover story had been organized around producing and maintaining across the 7 years between the Vienna ceremony and the Mirror's publication. The facts were the facts of the Baron's Nazi Party membership from 1930, his SS membership from 1933, his rank of major in the SS, his connection to Hermann Göring who had recommended him to the SS, and the additional allegations from Simon Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter whose specific professional function was the documentation and pursuit of the former members of the Nazi apparatus, that the Baron had been involved in the Lebensborn program. The Lebensborn program was the SS program that Heinrich Himmler had organized around the specific eugenic objective of the production of children of the Aryan characteristics that the Nazi ideology had identified as the characteristics of the racial ideal, and the involvement in the program was the involvement that Wiesenthal attributed to von Reibnitz as the person whose SS membership and whose specific biological characteristics had placed him in the program's orbit. Wiesenthal was careful. He said, "We know for sure that he was a member of the SS and that he was part of the Lebensborn program, but we have no evidence that he carried out atrocities." The careful was the careful of the person whose professional function required the careful distinction between the documented and the alleged, and who was applying the distinction to the specific case of the Baron, whose documentation the files provided, and whose atrocities the files did not document. The Lebensborn allegation was the allegation. The SS membership and the Nazi Party membership and the Göring connection were the documented facts. The palace's response was the response that the palace had been preparing for the publication of the story that the palace had known was the story that the Berlin Documentation Center's files could produce, and that the Mirror had now produced from those files. The response required the palace to produce the statement that addressed the publication in the form that addressed it, without acknowledging what the palace had known before the marriage, and what the palace had decided to manage in the form of the silence that had maintained the cover story across the 7 years. The statement was delivered by the palace spokesman Michael Shea, and it contained the 2 sentences that the hook of this account identified as the 2 sentences that should not be able to exist in the same statement. The first sentence established that Princess Michael had confirmed the truth of the Mirror's report about her father's SS membership. The second sentence established that the report had come as a total surprise to her and a total shock. The logical impossibility of the two sentences coexisting in the same statement was the logical impossibility that the palace's management of the statement had produced as the available statement, when the available statement was the statement that was required to simultaneously acknowledge the truth of the report and maintain the fiction of the ignorance. The acknowledgement of the truth established that the report was accurate about the Baron's SS membership, which was the establishment that the palace's management of the subsequent coverage required to be produced, so that the palace was not in the position of the institution that was denying the documented evidence of the Berlin Documentation Center's files. The maintenance of the fiction of the ignorance was the maintenance that the cover story's continuation required, because the acknowledgement of the prior knowledge was the acknowledgement that the palace had approved the marriage with knowledge of the SS officer in the background, and had decided that the knowledge was the knowledge that required management rather than disclosure. The two things could not both be true simultaneously. Either Princess Michael had confirmed the report because she knew enough about her father's background to confirm what the report said, or she had been in total ignorance of her father's background and could not have confirmed the report. The palace spokesman had produced the statement that required both to be simultaneously true, and the Daily Mirror had described the statement as unbelievable, and Philip Hall had said it struck him that someone was covering something up. Hall had found the evidence in the Berlin Documentation Center while researching a book about the royal family. The specific evidence he had found was the evidence that established the Baron as German rather than Austrian, which was the additional biographical detail that the princess had been presenting as the detail of her father's nationality in the interviews she had been giving about her background. She had described him as Austrian. The files established he was German. The nationality difference was the difference that Hall had identified as the first available indicator of the management of the background information in the direction of the cover, because the Austrian was the nationality that the Austrian Catholic formation required if the background was to be managed in the direction of the less specifically Nazi-associated, and the German was the nationality that the files established as the actual nationality that the cover had been organized around not presenting. He was obviously a committed Nazi, Hall told the BBC. He was not someone who drifted with the tide into the Nazi movement. The 1930 joining date was the evidence of the not drifting, because the drifting produced the 1933 or 1934 joining dates of the people whose relationship to the movement was the relationship of the opportunist rather than the true believer, and the 1930 date was the date that preceded the movement's ascent to power, and that therefore established the commitment of the person who had identified the movement as the movement before the movement had established itself as the inevitable. Harold Brooks Baker, of Burke's Peerage, spoke to the press in the days following the Mirror's publication, and was explicit about what the royal family would have found in the vetting process. He said the royal family had certainly inquired into the background of the von Reibnitz family. He said they had kept quiet for fear of a scandal. The keeping quiet was the keeping quiet that the cover story's management had required, and the fear of the scandal was the fear that the 1985 publication had now converted into the scandal that the fear had been organized around preventing. Princess Michael's own subsequent statements about the revelation occupied the specific register of the person who had received the information and who was producing the account of the receiving in the form that the account required, when the account was the account of the total surprise and the total shock. She said, in the television interview that the revelation required her to produce, that she had known her father had been a member of the party, but had grown up thinking it was an honorary role and a matter of protecting himself. The knowing and the not knowing were the two things that the television interview required to be simultaneously present in the statement, because the known required acknowledgement and the not known required the fiction of the surprise's maintenance. Here, I am 40 years old, she said, and I discover something that is really quite unpleasant. I shall just simply have to learn to live with it. The sentence was the sentence of the person who was performing the discovery in the form that the total surprise required, and the performance was the performance that the cover story had organized around the figure of the daughter, who had been shielded from the knowledge of her father's past by the specific combination of the post-war displacement and the father's distance, and the mother's own opposition to the regime. The performance was the available performance that the statement of the total surprise required, and the princess delivered it with the specific bearing of someone who had been performing the cover story's subject since the Vienna ceremony, and who understood that the performance of the discovery was the performance that the management of the revelation's aftermath required. The Queen's response to the revelation was the response that the institution produced when the management of the aftermath required the institutional signal about the institutional position's assessment of the revealed information, and the signal was the signal of the state banquet at Windsor Castle, to which Princess Michael was invited in the days immediately following the revelation's publication. The invitation was the institutional statement of the no ostracism, the specific signal that the institution was deploying to communicate to the public that the institution had received the revelation and had assessed the revelation and had concluded that the revelation was not the revelation that required the institutional response of the exclusion of the person whose father's past the revelation had revealed. The signal was the signal of the institution that had approved the marriage with the knowledge of the background, and that was now communicating that the background's public revelation had not changed the institutional assessment that had approved the marriage, despite the background. The signal was also the signal of the institution that was managing the aftermath in the direction of the management that the cover story's continuation required, rather than the management that the cover story's exposure would have produced if the institution had chosen to manage the aftermath in the direction of the honest accounting of what the institution had known before the marriage, and what the institution had decided to do with what it had known. The honest accounting would have required the palace to acknowledge that the vetting process had found the SS files and that the marriage had been approved despite the SS files, and that the management of the SS files' existence had been the management of the silence rather than the disclosure. The honest accounting was not the management option that the palace selected. The management option that the palace selected was the management of the total surprise and the total shock, and the state banquet invitation, and the continuation of the institutional relationship with the couple, whose background's most inconvenient dimension had now been moved from the managed private to the managed public. The managed public was the form the cover story took after 1985. Before 1985, the cover story had been the management of the private in the direction of the not public. After 1985, the cover story was the management of the public in the direction of the not further examined, which was the direction that the state banquet invitation and the no ostracism signal had organized the management around, and the not further examined was the management outcome that the institution had produced from the revelation in the form of the revelation absorbed rather than the revelation addressed. The revelation absorbed was the specific management outcome that the British royal family had developed across the decades of its management of the inconvenient, as the management mechanism that the inconvenient always produces when the institution's management of the inconvenient is the management of the absorption rather than the address. And the absorption of the revelation was the absorption that the state banquet invitation communicated, and that the subsequent years' continued institutional relationship with Princess Michael confirmed as the management outcome that the institution had selected. She was still at the institution's edge. The cover story was still covering. The SS files were now in the public record, rather than the Berlin Documentation Center. And the cover story's next chapter was already being written in the form of the subsequent years' management of the subsequent revelations that the subsequent years would produce from the marriage that the palace had approved with the knowledge of the files, and that the files' public revelation had not moved from the approved to the reconsidered. The subsequent revelations were the revelations of the racial incidents and the Kensington Palace financial arrangements and the Putin-access sting and the progression of the controversies that the marriage's subsequent decades were accumulating in the form of the managed public rather than the managed private, that the 1985 revelation had converted the cover story into. The managed public was the form the story took from 1985 onward, and the managed public's management was the management of the institution that had written the cover story and that was continuing to write it in the form of the management of each subsequent chapter as the chapters arrived. The chapters arrived with some regularity. The New York restaurant incident occurred in 2004 in the specific context of the London to New York social circuit that the British aristocracy and its adjacent social world conducted across the Atlantic in the specific manner of the people whose social world had expanded across the Atlantic to the degree that the New York social occasion was the social occasion that the London social world required its more prominent members to attend with the same regularity that the London social occasions required. Princess Michael was at a restaurant in New York, and the other diners at the restaurant included a group of Black American diners at a nearby table, and the group's noise level was, by whatever assessment Princess Michael was applying to the noise level that produced the specific response that the response produced. What the response was is the thing that the available record has preserved in the two versions that the two sides of the incident produced. The first version was the version that the diners at the other table produced, which was the version that described Princess Michael telling them to go back to the colonies. The "go back to the colonies" was the specific phrase that the diners reported and that the press reported from the diners, and the phrase was the phrase that the coverage of the incident organized its reporting around, because the phrase was the phrase that most precisely captured the specific quality of the incident's racial dimension in the vocabulary that the phrase provided. The second version was the version that Princess Michael produced, which was the version that she delivered in the interview she subsequently gave to address the first version's coverage, and the version was the version of the person who is producing the account of an incident that the first version has characterized in a way that the person producing the second version finds inaccurate. She said she had not told the diners to go back to the colonies. She said she would be ready to go back to the colonies herself. The distinction between the first version and the second version was the distinction of the "go back at you" versus the "go back at me," the distinction of the directive aimed at the other table, and the observation about the speaker's own inclinations regarding the colonial return. The second version then produced, in the interview that was providing the second version, the additional statement that the interview preserved in the form of the quote, that the subsequent coverage of the incident's context reproduced with the specific attention that the quote warranted. She told the interviewer, "I even pretended years ago to be an African, a half-caste African, but because of my light eyes, I did not get away with it, but I dyed my hair black. I traveled on African buses. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted experiences from Cape Town to right up in northern Mozambique. I had this adventure with these absolutely adorable special people, and to call me racist is a knife through the heart because I really love these people." The statement was the statement of someone who was mounting a defense of their relationship to the people of African descent in the specific register of the person who has decided that the defense's most effective available form is the form of the claimed solidarity, and the claimed solidarity was the solidarity of the person who had traveled on African buses and pretended to be of African descent, and who had found in the people of Africa the adorable and the special that the statement was organized around, communicating as the evidence of the non-racist's genuine engagement with the people the non-racist loved. The palace issued a statement. The statement said that Princess Michael deeply regretted any offense that may have been caused. The "any offense that may have been caused" was the formulation of the institutional apology that acknowledges the offense in the conditional form rather than the declarative form, which was the form that maintained the institutional distance between the acknowledgement of the offense and the acknowledgement of the offending, and the distance was the distance that the cover story's management required between the institution's acknowledgement and the incident's specific content. The Blackamoor brooch was December 2017, 13 years after the New York restaurant and 22 years after the 1995 incident, in which she had reportedly told Harry's then-girlfriend Chelsea Davy that mixed-race people should go back to their own countries, which was the earlier incident that the subsequent coverage of the 2017 brooch placed in the context of the pattern rather than the isolated incident. The pattern was the pattern that the subsequent years had been assembling across the incidents, and the December 2017 occasion was the occasion that the pattern's assembly had produced the most publicly visible expression of, because the December 2017 occasion was the Queen's Christmas lunch at Buckingham Palace, which was the occasion that the British royal family assembled for in the specific form of the family gathering rather than the official event, and the occasion was the occasion that Meghan Markle was attending for the first time as Prince Harry's fiancée. Meghan Markle, whose mother Doria Ragland is black, and whose public identity as a biracial woman had been the subject of the specific coverage that her relationship with Prince Harry had generated in the British and the international press across the preceding year, was at the Queen's Christmas lunch for the first time. Princess Michael of Kent was also at the Queen's Christmas lunch. Princess Michael of Kent was wearing a blackamoor brooch. The blackamoor brooch is a style of jewelry that dates to 16th century Venice, in which the design features a stylized figure of a black man, typically depicted in a manner that the subsequent centuries have examined in the specific terms of the exoticized and the stereotyped and the specifically dehumanizing that the 16th century Venetian tradition's relationship to the African figure had embedded in the design's visual vocabulary. The brooch that Princess Michael was wearing featured the head of a black man in a gold headdress and robe, and she was wearing it on the day that the British royal family was meeting the biracial American woman who was engaged to one of its members for the first time. The press photographed her arriving. The photographs showed the brooch. Social media received the photographs. Social media produced the response that social media produces when the photographs show the thing that social media identifies as the thing requiring the response, which was the response of the people who were identifying the brooch and its wearing on this specific occasion in relation to this specific person's first appearance at this specific family gathering as the statement rather than the accident, the deliberate rather than the incidental, the communication rather than the coincidence. Her spokesperson said the following day that she was very sorry and distressed that the brooch had caused offense. The very sorry and distressed was the institutional apology's more emotive register than the 2004 any offense that may have been caused, and the more emotive register was the register that the specific visibility of the 2017 occasion required, rather than the register that the 2004 occasion's management had produced. Because the 2017 occasion's visibility was the visibility of the photographs and the social media and the international press that the Queen's Christmas lunch's assembly of the extended royal family with the new American fiancé had generated, and the visibility required the more emotive register of the institutional apology. The sheep came from a Vanity Fair interview. An ex-boyfriend of Princess Michael's daughter, Lady Gabriella Windsor, gave the interview to Vanity Fair and described his experience of the near-royal family membership that the relationship had produced. And in the description, he included the observation about the two black sheep that Princess Michael kept at her property in the Gloucestershire countryside, and that she had named Venus and Serena. The Venus and Serena were the names of the Williams sisters, Venus Williams and Serena Williams, who were at the time of the sheep's naming among the most prominent black athletes in the world, and whose names in the context of the black sheep's naming produced the specific reading that the ex-boyfriend's description of the naming had communicated to the Vanity Fair readership. The ex-boyfriend was careful in the way that the person who is describing the behavior of the family they have left is careful when they want to communicate the behavior without producing the account of the communication that the family can characterize as the hostile account rather than the accurate one. He said, "Princess Michael, though generally free of British colonial prejudices and beyond reproach when it came to me, nevertheless invited trouble out of what felt like a desire to shock. The invited trouble and the desire to shock were the formulation that the careful description of the behavior produced when the behavior was the behavior of the black sheep named Venus and Serena, and the person describing it was the person who had been in proximity to the behavior and who was now describing it in the carefully qualified register. The palace did not respond to the sheep naming. The non-response was the management option that the palace selected for the sheep naming in the specific way that the palace selects the non-response for the incidents whose response would produce more coverage of the incident than the non-response, and the sheep naming's coverage was the coverage that the Vanity Fair interview had produced, and that the non-response was organized around not extending into the coverage that the response would have generated. The three incidents together, the New York restaurant, the blackamoor brooch, the sheep, are the three incidents that the pattern requires to be examined as the pattern, rather than the isolated incidents that the palace's management of each had been organized around, presenting as the isolated rather than the patterned. The pattern was the pattern of the person whose relationship to the people of African descent and to the social world of race in Britain had produced, across the years of the incidents, the specific accumulation of the incidents that the pattern's examination requires to be assembled, and that the assembled pattern produces the picture of when the picture is the picture of the accumulation rather than the isolated event. The picture that the accumulation produces is the picture that the cover story had been organized around, not producing in the form of the assembled pattern, because the assembled pattern was the assembled pattern of the person whose institutional membership required the palace's management of each incident in the form of the isolated rather than the patterned, and the managing of the isolated prevented the assembled pattern from being the thing that the public received rather than the thing that the incident's accumulation was producing in the background of the managing. The background was where the pattern accumulated. The cover story's management of each incident in the form of the isolated was the management that kept the pattern in the background. The background was where this account has been finding the things that the cover story had been organized around keeping there. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I really do love hearing from you. It keeps me going. In the spring of 2021, Channel 4's Dispatches program and the Sunday Times newspaper collaborated on an undercover investigation into the commercial practices of members of the British royal family, and the investigation was organized around the specific mechanism that the undercover investigation deploys when the subject of the investigation is the person whose commercial practices the investigation is organized around documenting, which was the mechanism of the false company and the false executives and the false commercial proposition that the false executives of the false company were presenting to the subject of the investigation as the commercial proposition, whose acceptance would establish the commercial practice being investigated. The false company was called House of Haedong. The House of Haedong was a South Korean gold investment company in the specific sense that undercover investigations' false companies are South Korean gold investment companies, which was the sense of the company that did not exist, but that the undercover reporters who had constructed its existence had constructed with sufficient detail and sufficient plausibility to present to the subject of the investigation as the company that existed and that was seeking the specific commercial engagement that the investigation was organized around. The detail included the South Korean identity, which was the identity that the false company's construction had selected as the appropriate identity for the company whose commercial proposition was the commercial proposition of the gold investment and the Russian connections that the gold investment in Russia required. The approach was the approach that the investigation had made to 5 members of the British royal family, which was the approach of the letter that established the commercial proposition in the form that the false company's executives were offering. And the letter established that the House of Haedong was seeking a royal to market its investment service and was willing to pay for the royal's endorsement and the royal's commercial representation in the form that the royal's specific position in the social world of the British monarchy and the Kremlin's social world made available. 5 members of the royal family were approached. Prince Michael of Kent was the member whose response produced the engagement that the investigation had documented in the form of the Zoom call. The Zoom call was the meeting that the engagement produced in the form of the virtual meeting that the COVID-19 pandemic's specific conditions had converted from the in-person meeting to the virtual one. And the virtual one was the meeting that the investigation's undercover reporters attended in the person of the false executives of the House of Haedong, and that Prince Michael attended in the person of Prince Michael of Kent, Queen Elizabeth's first cousin, speaking Russian and offering his connection to Russia as the asset whose value the commercial engagement was organized around deploying. He told the undercover reporters that his long-standing connection to Russia could bring some benefit to their company. The long-standing connection to Russia was the connection that the military career's Russian language acquisition and the Russo-British Chamber of Commerce patronage and the Order of Friendship from Medvedev in 2009 and the years of the Russian social world's cultivation had produced, and the could bring some benefit was the formulation of the person who was communicating the value of the connection without stating the value in the terms that the stating of the value in those terms would require. He told them he would be very excited to work with their company. he offered them his royal endorsement in a recorded speech. The recorded speech was the specific commercial product that the endorsement would produce in the form of the video of the royal endorsement that the investment company could use in the marketing of its investment service, and the fee for the recorded speech was the fee that the investigation had subsequently reported as $200,000. The $200,000 was the fee of the royal endorsement in the specific commercial market of the investment company that was seeking the royal endorsement as the marketing instrument whose deployment in the investment company's marketing would produce the return on the $200,000 investment in the endorsement. He was happy to use his home in Kensington Palace as a backdrop. The Kensington Palace backdrop was the specific asset that the endorsement's production required as the visual context that established the royal endorsement's institutional authenticity in the form of the image rather than the statement, because the image of the person giving the royal endorsement in front of the Kensington Palace backdrop was the image that communicated the royal endorsement's specific institutional authority in the most immediately legible form available, which was the form of the person in the royal residence that the person who is in the royal residence has produced as the backdrop for the commercial endorsement. The Kensington Palace backdrop was the apartment whose rent was £69 per week. The royal residence whose visual authority the $200,000 endorsement speech was being organized around using was the residence that the Queen was subsidizing to the extent of £120,000 per year from her private funds. The commercial deployment of the visual authority of the publicly subsidized royal residence in the service of the $200,000 endorsement speech was the commercial deployment that the palace's management of the not-working royals who receive no public funding narrative had been organized around not having to account for. Then Prince Michael left the Zoom call. The leaving of the Zoom call was the leaving that produced the specific dimension of the investigation's documentation that the staying on the call had not produced, because the staying on the call had produced the documentation of what Prince Michael was willing to offer the House of Haedong's false executives in the form of the royal endorsement and the Kensington Palace backdrop and the Russian connection and the very excited to work with your company. The leaving of the call produced the documentation of what the Marquis of Reading was willing to offer the House of Haedong's false executives after the person whose royal identity the offering was organized around had left the room. The Marquis of Reading was Lord Simon Isaacs, Prince Michael's friend and business partner of 30 years, and his presence on the Zoom call after Prince Michael's departure was the presence of the person whose function in the commercial relationship between the royal connection and the commercial client was the function of the intermediary who translates the royal connection's value into the specific commercial terms that the commercial client can assess and act on. The translation required the specification of the value in terms that the prince's own presence on the call had not permitted him to specify without producing the account of the commercial relationship that the prince's own statement of the terms would have produced. Lord Reading specified the terms. He said, "I think, if I can say this is kind of slightly discreet. We're talking relatively discreetly here, because we wouldn't want the world to know that he is seeing Putin purely for business reasons, if you follow me." The "wouldn't want the world to know" was the specific statement of the commercial relationships management in the form of the discretion that the relationship required, and the discretion was the discretion of the person who understood that the commercial relationship between the royal and the Kremlin was the commercial relationship that the world's knowing of it would convert from the available commercial relationship to the unavailable one, because the world's knowing of it would produce the coverage that the royals' commercial relationship with the Kremlin's representatives would generate in the specific political context of 2021, when the United Kingdom's government had identified Russia as a prime national security threat, and when the Kremlin was being led by the person whose assassination of political opponents and poisoning of people on British soil had organized the British government's relationship to Russia around the specific quality of the threat, rather than the specific quality of the commercial opportunity. He said Prince Michael was not seen as political in Russia. He said Prince Michael was seen as a friend of Russia. He said Prince Michael was highly regarded due to his royal family heritage. He said Prince Michael was Her Majesty's unofficial ambassador to Russia. The unofficial ambassador to Russia was the characterization of the royal, whose commercial function in the relationship between the British monarch's extended family and the Kremlin was the characterization that the Marquis of Reading was producing for the false executives of the House of Haydong as the specific value proposition of the commercial engagement, and the value proposition was the value proposition of the unofficial ambassador to Russia, who was not seen as political and who was a friend of Russia and who was highly regarded and who could open the door to Putin. If he is representing the House of Haydong, Lord Reading said, he could mention that to Putin, and Putin would find the right person who is interested in South Korea or interested in gold. It just opens the door, which is so helpful. The opening of the door was the specific commercial service that the Royal Connections deployment in the direction of the Kremlin was being offered to produce for the South Korean gold investment company's false executives. And the door was the door that the Her Majesty's unofficial ambassador to Russia's connection to Putin could open for the people who needed the door opened and who were willing to pay the fee that the door's opening required. The fee for the making of the representations to Putin's representatives was reported at £10,000 per day. The total figure for the full engagement was reported at approximately £143,000. Prince Michael's office responded to the program with the statement that Prince Michael has no special relationship with President Putin. The no special relationship was the statement that the Marquis of Reading's characterization of Prince Michael as Her Majesty's unofficial ambassador to Russia had made the statement most immediately in need of production, and the production was the production of the statement that the cover story's management of the incident required to be produced as the distancing statement that established the distance between the commercial characterization and the institutional reality that the commercial characterization was being positioned in relation to. Prince Michael said he had not been in contact with the Russian president since 2003. The not since 2003 was the statement that was not the statement of the no special relationship, because the no special relationship was the statement of the person who had never had the relationship that the special characterized, and the not since 2003 was the statement of the person who had been in contact with the Russian president until 2003 and who was now characterizing the relationship in the temporal terms of the last contact's date, rather than the relationship's existence. Buckingham Palace said it could not speak on Prince Michael's behalf, as he was not a working member of the royal family. The not a working member of the royal family was the institutional designation that the palace had been using since the Vienna ceremony of 1978, to establish the distance between the institution and the person whose institutional membership was the membership of the edge, rather than the center, and the deployment of the not a working member formulation in the management of the Putin stings coverage was the deployment of the management instrument that the cover story had always used when the cover story required the institutional distance between the institution and the incident involving the person at the institution's edge. The distance was maintained. The cover story continued. Prince Michael remained at the institution's edge, which was the edge where the cover story had been managing him since 1978, and the edge was where the cover story's management of the Putin sting placed him in the same form that the cover story's management of the SS Revelation and the Kensington Palace finances and the racial incidents had placed him, which was the form of the person who was managed by the cover story, rather than the person for whom the cover story had been written. The cover story had been written for the marriage was the cover story, and the cover story's management of the Putin sting was the cover story's management of the thing that the cover story had always been managing, which was the gap between the institutional presentation and the institutional reality that the presentation was organized around not presenting. The House of Commons Public Accounts Committee is the parliamentary committee whose specific function is the examination of the government's use of public funds, and the examination is the examination that the committee conducts with the specific authority of the parliamentary oversight mechanism that the British constitutional settlement has organized around the principle that the expenditure of public money requires the accountability to the public's elected representatives in the form of the examination that the committee provides. The committee in 2002 was conducting the examination of the royal household's financial arrangements, and the examination had produced, in the course of the examining, the discovery of the specific financial arrangement that the Kents had been operating under for the duration of the marriage that the palace had approved in Vienna in 1978. The discovery was the discovery of the £69 per week rent. The £69 per week was the sum that Prince and Princess Michael of Kent were paying for the occupation of the apartment at Kensington Palace that they had been occupying since the early years of the marriage, and the £69 per week was the sum that the committee's examination had identified as the sum that the palace's management of the housing arrangement for the couple had been organized around as the rent that the arrangement required the couple to pay. The £69 per week was the weekly rent of the Kensington Palace apartment in 2002. The Kensington Palace apartment that the £69 per week represented was not the apartment of the person who was paying the market rate for the accommodation that the market would have required to be paid for the occupation of an apartment at Kensington Palace of the scale that Prince and Princess Michael of Kent were occupying. The market rate for the occupation of an apartment at Kensington Palace of the scale that the couple were occupying would have produced a rental figure that the London residential property market of 2002 had established for properties of comparable scale and location, and the comparable scale and location in the London of 2002 was the scale and location of the figure that was considerably in excess of the £69 per week that the couple were paying. The committee called for the Queen to evict her cousins and charge a market rate. The calling for the eviction and the market rate was the calling of the Parliamentary Committee, whose examination of the financial arrangement had produced the assessment that the financial arrangement was the financial arrangement that the public's elected representatives could not endorse as the appropriate use of the royal resources that the accommodation represented. The eviction and the market rate were the recommendations of the committee that was applying the principle of the public accountability to the financial arrangement that the examination had produced the discovery of. Buckingham Palace responded. The response was the response that the palace's management of the discovery required to be produced as the explanation of the financial arrangement in the form that the explanation needed to take when the explanation was the explanation of the arrangement that the committee had characterized as the arrangement requiring the eviction and the market rate. The palace's statement said, "The Queen is paying the rent for Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's apartment at a commercial rate of £120,000 annually, from her own private funds." The statement then continued, "This rent payment by the Queen is in recognition of the royal engagements and work for various charities which Prince and Princess Michael of Kent have undertaken at their own expense, and without any public funding." The two sentences of the palace's statement were the two sentences that the financial architecture's management required to be produced when the architecture's examination had produced the discovery that required the explanation, and the two sentences established the financial architecture in the form that the architecture required to be established, which was the form of the Queen's private funds rather than the public funds, and the recognition of the royal engagements rather than the public funds, and the recognition of the royal engagements rather than the public funds. The first sentence established that the commercial rate was being paid. The commercial rate was £120,000 annually, which was the annual figure that the £69 per week did not produce, and the commercial rate was being paid by the Queen from her private funds rather than by the couple who were occupying the apartment. The palace's explanation had converted the couple's payment of £69 per week into the Queen's payment of £120,000 per year, by establishing that the Queen was paying the commercial rate, and the couple were paying the £69 that the commercial rate exceeded by the difference that the Queen's private funds were covering. The difference between the £69 per week and the £120,000 per year was the difference that the financial architecture's management had been organizing the cover story's financial dimension around for the duration of the marriage, and the difference was the difference that the Queen's private funds had been covering in the recognition of the royal engagements that the couple had been undertaking at their own expense. The recognition of the royal engagements at their own expense was the institutional acknowledgement that the couple was performing the institutional function without the institutional support of the working royal, and the recognition was the form of the institutional support that was organized around the private rather than the public. The distinction between the private and the public in the British royal family's financial architecture is the distinction that the architecture's management deploys when the architecture requires the distinction to be maintained between the publicly funded institutional support of the working royal and the privately funded institutional support of the not working royal, who is nonetheless performing institutional functions. The distinction is the distinction of the source of the funding rather than the distinction of the function being funded, and the source of the funding being the Queen's private funds rather than the public funds was the source that maintained the not working royal designation for the couple, despite the couple's performance of the functions that the recognition of the royal engagements was acknowledging as the functions being performed. The civil list had never included Prince and Princess Michael of Kent. The civil list was the parliamentary provision for the funding of the members of the royal family whose institutional functions required the institutional funding of the working royal, and the civil list's exclusion of the couple was the exclusion that established their not working royal designation in the formal parliamentary record that the civil list produced. The formal parliamentary record's exclusion was the exclusion that the palace's narrative of the independent couple, who were managing without the public funding, had always deployed as the evidence of the independence, and the evidence was the evidence of the formal exclusion from the publicly funded civil list, rather than the evidence of the actual financial independence from the institutional support. The actual financial independence from the institutional support was not the condition of the couple's financial situation, because the actual financial situation was the situation of the Queen's £120,000 annual payment from her private funds, and the security costs, and the travel costs, and the specific variety of the institutional support that the performing of the royal engagements required, and that the performing was being provided with in the form of the institutional support that was the private rather than the public, and the private rather than the public was the form that maintained the not working royal designation while simultaneously providing the institutional support that the working royal's designation would have formalized. The security costs were the security costs of the people whose institutional membership in the royal family required the security provision that the membership produced as the standard provision for the members of the institution. The couple received security from the Metropolitan Police, which was the publicly funded security provision that the membership in the royal family generated for the members of the institution, regardless of their working royal designation. And the Metropolitan Police's provision of the security was the provision of the public resource whose cost was the cost that the public account did not appear in the narrative of the couple's independence from the public funding, because the security was the standard provision rather than the specifically designated support. The travel costs were the costs that the performing of the royal engagements generated in the form of the travel that the engagements required, and the travel was the travel that the royal household's management of the engagements organized in the form of the provision of the travel resources that the engagements required the person performing them to have access to. The couple performed approximately 100 public engagements per year, which was the engagement level that the palace's statement had characterized as the royal engagements being undertaken at their own expense, and the at their own expense was the characterization of the engagements whose costs were the costs that the couple was bearing, rather than the public account. The commercial income was the income that the not working royal's financial architecture required, when the institutional income was the income of the Queen's private funds, rather than the civil list's public provision. The commercial income was the income that Prince Michael's management consultancy produced from the commercial relationships whose deployment of the royal name and the Russian connections and the Kensington Palace backdrop had been the subject of the Channel 4 and Sunday Times investigation in 2021. And the commercial income was the income that Princess Michael's books and interior design work produced from the specific commercial deployment of the formation and the taste that the Victoria and Albert Museum course and the Central European aristocratic background had produced. The commercial income and the Queen's private funds and the Metropolitan Police security and the royal household's travel support together constituted the financial architecture of the not working royals who were managing without the public funding. And the financial architecture's management of the distinction between the private and the public had been the financial dimension of the cover story that the palace had written for the marriage, and that the marriage's financial architecture had been performing since the Vienna ceremony of 1978. The committees calling for the eviction and the market rate had not produced the eviction or the market rate. The palace's statement had produced the explanation of the commercial rate being paid from the Queen's private funds in the recognition of the royal engagements, and the explanation had produced the management of the committee's discovery in the form of the explanation that the explanation required, rather than the reform of the financial arrangement that the committee's recommendation had produced. The financial arrangement had continued after the committee's discovery in the form of the continued payment of the Queen's £120,000 annual provision from her private funds, and the continued performance of the royal engagements at the couple's own expense, and the continued maintenance of the not-working royal designation that the civil list's continued exclusion of the couple produced in the formal parliamentary record. The architecture stood, the cover story continued. The £69 per week was the £69 per week of the cover story's financial dimension, and the £120,000 annual payment was the £120,000 annual payment of the financial architecture's management of the distinction between the private and the public that the cover story required. And the distinction was the distinction that the financial architecture had been managing since 1978, and that the committee's 2002 discovery had converted from the managed private to the managed public in the specific form of the Parliament's having examined the architecture and having produced the recommendation for the eviction and the market rate, that the palace's explanation had converted from the recommendation into the explained and the continued. The explained and the continued was the financial architecture's condition after the committee's discovery, and the explained and the continued was the condition of the cover story's financial dimension in the specific form that the financial dimension had taken since the discovery, which was the form of the publicly known but the institutionally maintained, the discovered but the unreformed, the examined but the continued. The cover story's maintenance of the unreformed was the maintenance of the institution that had been managing the Kents's marriage as the cover story since the Vienna ceremony, and that had been managing the cover story's various dimensions as the dimensions required the management. And the financial architecture was the dimension that the committee's 2002 discovery had required the management to manage, in the form of the publicly known unreformed, rather than the privately maintained unknown. The privately maintained unknown had been the cover story's preferred form. The publicly known unreformed was the form the cover story had taken in 2002. The committee's recommendation had not been implemented. The architecture had continued. Lord Frederick Windsor was born on the 6th of April 1979, 10 months after the Vienna ceremony, and his birth was the birth of the first child of the marriage that the palace had approved with the knowledge of the SS files and the Catholic faith and the succession rights waiver and the cover story that the approval had required the palace to produce and maintain. He was born Lord Frederick Windsor because the specific rules of the British peerage's management of the titles that the children of the royal family's members receive had established that the son of a prince who was not a royal highness by birth would bear the courtesy title of lord rather than the prince designation, and the lord designation was the designation that the cover story's edge position produced for the first child, in the same way that the edge position had produced the management constraints of the marriage's approval. Frederick grew up at Kensington Palace, and at the family's country property, and in the specific social environment of the British upper class, that the royal family's membership and the Kensington Palace address, and the Central European aristocratic formation, had produced as the available social environment for the children of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent. The available social environment was the social environment of the institution's edge, rather than the institution's centre, which was the edge that his father had always occupied and that the cover story had been managing since before Frederick's birth, and that Frederick's growing up inside the cover story had produced in him the specific formation of the person who is inside the institution and who understands the institution from the inside rather than from the outside. He was educated at Eton, which was the formation that the male children of the royal family's members received as the standard educational preparation for the adult life that the institution's membership and the British upper classes formation required, and the Eton formation produced in Frederick the specific qualities that the Eton formation produced in the people it formed, which were the qualities of the social ease and the institutional confidence and the specific variety of the educated Englishman's engagement with the world that the formation had been producing in the English upper class for the centuries of the formation's operation. He worked in finance. The working in finance was the working of the person who had been formed inside the institution's edge and who had identified in the financial services industry the available form of the professional career that the edge position's membership in the royal family's social world made most available. Which was the form of the career that the royal family's social world adjacent to the financial services industry generated as the available career for the person whose formation and social connections and institutional membership had produced the specific combination of the social asset and the professional capability that the financial services industry's social world deployed in the direction of the career's management. Sophie Winkleman was a British actress whose professional career had produced the specific social prominence that the acting career in Britain generates for the actor whose work the British television and theatre world had placed in the public's attention, and she was the woman who occupied the specific position in Frederick's social world that the social world's organization around the person whose presence in the room produced the noticing had organized around her. The marriage was the marriage of two people whose social worlds had produced the proximity that the marriage required. And the marriage was the marriage that the cover story's next generation required, in the form of the marriage that the edge position's children produce, when the edge position's formation has been the formation of the two people who have been formed inside adjacent positions in the social world. They have two daughters. Maud Elizabeth Daphne Marina was born in August 2013, and Isabella Frederick Ingrid Georgia was born in January 2016, and the daughters were the daughters of the marriage that the edge position's next generation had produced in the form of the grandchildren that Prince and Princess Michael of Kent's marriage had produced as the continuation of the family that the Vienna ceremony had begun. Lady Gabriella Windsor was born on the 23rd of April 1981, 2 years after Frederick, and she was born Lady Gabriella Windsor because the same peerage rules that had produced the Lord designation for Frederick had produced the Lady designation for the daughter, and the Lady designation was the designation of the edge position's female child in the specific way that the Lord was the designation of the edge position's male child. She grew up in the same social environment that Frederick had grown up in, the Kensington Palace environment, and the country property, and the British upper class's social world, and the growing up produced in her the specific formation that the same available social environment produced in the person who was inside it. She worked as a journalist and a writer. The journalism and the writing were the professional activities that the formation had produced in her as the available professional expression of the intelligence and the social observation and the specific quality of the person whose formation at the institution's edge had developed the capacity for the documentation of the social world that the journalism and the writing required. She wrote about the royal family and the social world adjacent to the royal family and the specific cultural environment of the British upper class that her formation had placed her inside, and the writing was the writing of someone who understood the inside of the institution from the inside rather than the outside. She married Thomas Kingston in May 2019. Thomas Kingston was a financier, a man whose professional career had been the career of the financial services industry and whose social world had been the social world that the City of London's financial establishment and the British upper class produced as the social environment of the people whose professional and personal formation had placed them inside it. The marriage was the marriage of two people who had found each other in the social world that their formations had placed them inside, and the wedding was the wedding at Windsor that the family's membership in the royal family's social world produced as the appropriate venue for the occasion that the membership generated. Thomas Kingston died on the 25th of February, 2024. He was 45 years old. He was found at his parents' house in the village of Stow-on-the-Wold in Gloucestershire, and the finding was the finding that the police who attended the scene determined had been the finding of a man who had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and the self-inflicted gunshot wound was the cause of death that the inquest that followed the death established as the cause in the formal legal process that the cause of death by self-inflicted injury requires in the English legal system. The death produced in the family the specific response that the death of the young husband and son-in-law produces in the family whose loss the death is, and the response was the response of the grief and the shock, and the specific quality of the loss that the sudden death of the 45-year-old produces in the people who are the people of the 45-year-old's daily life. Gabriella's response was the response of the widow, and the widow's response was the response that the person who has lost the person they had married 5 years earlier, and who was managing the loss, in the specific context of being the daughter of Prince and Princess Michael of Kent, and therefore a person whose loss was the loss of the person whose institutional membership in the family produced the coverage of the loss, as well as the experience of it. The palace issued a statement. The statement expressed the deep sadness of the royal family at the death of Thomas Kingston, and extended the condolences to the family and the loved ones whose loss the statement was acknowledging. The deep sadness was the institutional register of the condolence that the palace produced for the deaths that occurred in the social world of the royal family's extended membership, and the deep sadness was the register that the statement deployed for the death of the person who was the son-in-law of the Queen's first cousin and the husband of the lady who was the daughter of the cover story's marriage. The cover story's management of the Kingston death was the management of the specific dimension of the cover story that the death had produced, which was the dimension of the grief that the family was experiencing, and that the institutional coverage of the family's grief was organized around managing in the form of the condolence statement and the expression of the support for the widow and the acknowledgement of the loss that the palace's management of the family's grief in the public dimension required. The managing of the grief's public dimension was the managing that the cover story's continuation in the next generation required, when the next generation's grief was the grief that the public dimension of the institutional membership organized around managing. The death also produced the specific dimension of the cover story's management of the wider context in which the death had occurred, which was the context of the couple's 5 years of marriage, and the specific quality of what the marriage had contained that the death had ended. And the context was the context that the cover story's management of the public dimension of the family's experience was organized around not providing the specificity of the documentation that the public dimension had not been given access to in the form of the interior of the marriage that had ended. The interior of the marriage was the interior that the palace's management of the family's members' private lives had always been organized around maintaining as the private rather than the public, and the Kingston marriage's interior was the interior that the management maintained as the private in the specific form of the death's coverage's management around the deep sadness and the condolences rather than the specific quality of what the marriage had been. Frederick and Gabriella were the children that the cover story had produced in the next generation, and the next generation's children were the grandchildren of the cover story's marriage, and the continuation of the family that the Vienna ceremony had begun, and that the palace's management of the cover story had maintained across the 47 years between the Vienna ceremony and the Stow-on-the-Wold finding. The grandchildren were the grandchildren of the SS Major's daughter and the Queen's first cousin, and they were the grandchildren in the specific form that the cover story's next generation had produced them, which was the form of the Lord and the Lady, and the actress wife, and the financier husband, and the Maud, and the Isabella, and the death in Gloucestershire, and the deep sadness of the palace's statement. The cover story was in its 4th decade of the management of the next generation by 2024, and the next generation's management was the management of the grandchildren, and the marriages, and the deaths, and the grief that the cover story's continuation in the form of the family that the Vienna ceremony had produced required to be managed as the cover story had always managed the things it was required to manage, which was in the form of the institutional statement and the condolence and the deep sadness and the private interior that the management maintained as the private rather than the public. The private interior of the cover story was what the cover story had always been managing. The next generation was the generation that was now managing the private interior in the form of the grief that the Stow-on-the-Wold finding had produced, and that the deep sadness statement had acknowledged, and that the cover story's continuation required to be the cover story's acknowledgement rather than the cover story's interior. The Kensington Palace staircase produced, in the autumn of 2024, the specific injury that the staircase produces when the person descending it has lost their footing while carrying the multiple overcoats that the person was carrying when the footing was lost. Princess Michael of Kent was carrying several overcoats as she descended the staircase of the Kensington Palace apartment that the Queen had been paying £120,000 per year for from her private funds since the Financial Architecture's establishment, and that the Public Accounts Committee had discovered in 2002, and that the palace had explained and continued rather than reformed. The overcoats were the overcoats of the person who was carrying them, rather than the person for whom the carrying would have been performed by someone whose function was the carrying. And the carrying of the overcoats was the carrying of the person who was managing the domestic logistics of the apartment in the form of the personally, rather than the institutionally managed. The fall produced the specific injuries that the fall of the person of 80 years old who has put out their hands to stop the falling produces, which were the broken small bones of both wrists. The breaking of the small bones of both wrists was the breaking that the doctors who treated the injuries described in the terms of the specific constraint that the injuries imposed on the daily activities that the wrists are required to perform, and the constraint was the constraint of the inability to complete the simple activities that the wrist's function in the daily life requires, including brushing the teeth, which was the specific daily activity that the accounts of the injury identified as the activity that the broken wrists had made unavailable to the person whose wrists the breaking had injured. The doctors warned that any wrong movement could hinder the recovery. The warning was the warning of the medical management of the injury of the person of 80 years old, whose recovery from the broken bones required the specific management of the movement that the recovery's process required to be organized around, rather than the management of the movement that the daily life's normal conduct produced. And the warning established the specific quality of the injury's recovery's requirements in the terms that the medical management of the injury required to be communicated to the person managing the recovery. The fall happened less than a year after her heart surgery. The heart surgery had been in 2023, and the heart surgery of 2023 had been the medical intervention that the heart condition whose management had required the surgical intervention had produced, and the recovery from the heart surgery had been the recovery that the person of 78 years old, whose heart had required the surgical intervention, manages in the form of the specific constraints on the activity and the energy that the recovery requires. The fall in 2024 had happened in the specific period following the heart surgery, in which the recovery's constraints were still the constraints that the medical management of the recovery had established, and the fall had produced the additional injuries of the broken wrists in the period when the recovery from the heart surgery was the recovery that the additional injuries were now complicating. The stroke arrived in 2025. A friend of Princess Michael told the Daily Mail, "Her Royal Highness suffered a stroke. Sadly, she is now bedridden." The bedridden was the condition that the stroke had produced in the person who had been managing the recovery from the heart surgery and the broken wrists in the Kensington Palace apartment, and who was now managing the stroke's specific consequences in the form of the bedridden condition that the stroke had produced. The bedridden was the final available form of the condition that the health's deterioration across the heart surgery and the fall and the broken wrists and the stroke had produced across the years of the deterioration's accumulation in the person who had been the Princess Pushy and the blackamoor brooch wearer and the colony's remark maker and the sheep namer and the total surprise performer and the cover story's subject for the 47 years of the marriage's duration. The last public appearance had been in September 2026 at the funeral of Catherine, the Duchess of Kent. The Duchess of Kent was the wife of the Duke of Kent, who was Prince Michael's elder brother Edward, and the funeral was the family occasion whose institutional character required the family member's presence, in the form of the attendance that the funeral of the family member produces, as the expected attendance of the people, for whom the loss is the family's loss, rather than merely the institutional occasion. Princess Michael had attended, which was the attending of the person who was managing the bedridden condition's specific constraints, in the form of the sufficient management to attend the funeral that the family loss required the attending of. Prince Michael attended Kate Middleton's Together at Christmas Carol service at Westminster Abbey in December 2024 without his wife and using a wheelchair. The wheelchair was the mobility assistance that the Prince of 82 years old, whose health had produced the need for the mobility assistance, was using for the navigation of the Westminster Abbey's specific geography, and the wife's absence was the absence of the person whose bedridden condition had made the attendance unavailable. The two of them had been the cover story's subjects for 47 years, and the December 2024 carol service was the occasion at which one of the cover story's subjects was present with the mobility assistance and the other was absent with the health condition. The cover story had been running for 47 years by December 2024. The cover story that the palace had written for the Vienna ceremony of June 1978 had been running for 47 years of the SS Revelation management and the Princess Pushy manufacturing and the Kensington Palace finances and the racial incidents management and the Putin sting management and the next generation's production and the health dimension's arrival. And the health dimension was the final chapter of the cover story, in the specific sense that the final chapter is the chapter that arrives when the story has been running for 47 years and the subjects of the story have reached the ages and the health conditions that the 47 years and the 82 and the 81 have produced. The final chapter of the cover story was the chapter that the heart surgery and the staircase fall and the broken wrists and the stroke and the wheelchair had written in the health dimension, and the health dimension was the dimension of the cover story that the cover story had not been organized around, but that the cover story's duration had produced as the available chapter when the cover story's duration had reached the 47 years that the health dimension required to become the available chapter. The available chapter was the chapter of the elderly couple in the Kensington Palace apartment, whose queen had been paying the £120,000 annual commercial rate from her private funds until the Queen's death in September 2022, and whose king was paying the rate from his private funds since the Queen's death had transferred the private funding to the person whose private funds the funding now required. The king was paying. Charles III had inherited from his mother not merely the throne and the crown and the institutional management of the British monarchy, but also the specific financial arrangement of the cover story's financial architecture that the Queen's private funding had been organizing since the Public Accounts Committee's 2002 discovery and the palace's explanation and continuation rather than reform. The inheritance of the financial architecture was the inheritance of the management of the distance between the private and the public that the financial architecture required to be maintained, and the maintenance was the maintenance of the cover story's financial dimension in the form of the privately funded rather than the publicly funded that the working royal distinction required. The cover story's financial dimension's maintenance was the maintenance that the king's private funds were now providing in the place of the Queen's private funds that had been providing it before the Queen's death, and the maintenance was the maintenance of the arrangement that the Public Accounts Committee had recommended reforming in 2002, and that the palace had explained rather than reformed in 2002, and that had continued in the explained rather than reformed form through the Queen's private provision and into the King's private provision, without the reform that the committee's recommendation had been the recommendation of. The couple had been in the Kensington Palace apartment since the early years of the marriage. The apartment had been the apartment of the cover story's domestic dimension, the specific physical location of the cover story's subject's daily life across the 47 years of the cover story's management, and the apartment had been the £69 per week, and then the explained £120,000 annual, and then the continued £120,000 annual in the form of the Queen's private funds, and then the continued £120,000 annual in the form of the King's private funds. And throughout the progression of the financial architecture's management, the apartment had remained the apartment that it had always been, which was the Kensington Palace apartment of the cover story's subjects. The subjects of the cover story were in the apartment. One was bedridden from the stroke. One was attending family occasions in the wheelchair. The cover story had been running for 47 years, and the final chapter's writing was the writing of the health dimension's accumulation of the heart surgery and the staircase fall and the broken wrists and the stroke and the wheelchair across the years that the health dimension had been accumulating in the people who had been the cover story's subjects since the Vienna ceremony. The cover story's final chapter was not the chapter that the palace had written when the palace had written the cover story's beginning in the form of the approval of the marriage and the management of the SS files and the succession rights waiver and the Vienna ceremony rather than the London ceremony, and the Princess Michael of Kent designation, rather than the Marie Christine von Reibnitz designation. The palace had written the cover story's beginning. The cover story's final chapter was being written by the staircase, and the stroke, and the wheelchair, in the specific form that 47 years of the cover story produces in the people who have been the cover story's subjects for 47 years. The final chapter was the chapter of the bedridden and the wheelchair, and the December carol service without the wife, and the September funeral with the wife. The final chapter was the chapter that the cover story had always been moving toward, in the form of the chapter that the 47 years produce, which was the chapter of the two people who had been the cover story's subjects since 1978, and who were now the 82 and the 81, whose health was the health that the 47 years, and the heart surgery, and the staircase, and the stroke had produced. The cover story was still running. The final chapter was the chapter the cover story was now in. The title of this account proposed that the Kents' marriage was a cover story the palace wrote together, and the proposal requires the accounting that the 11 parts have been building toward, in the same way that every title's proposition requires the honest accounting when the account has been assembled from the available evidence. The honest accounting of the cover story proposition requires the examination of what the cover story was actually covering, because the cover story is not the cover story if it is covering nothing, and the covering of nothing is the possibility that the honest accounting must address before the covering of something can be established as the thing the account has assembled the evidence to establish. The something that the cover story was covering was not a single thing. The something was the accumulation of the specific things that the preceding 10 parts have assembled from the available evidence, and the assembly has produced the picture of the accumulation rather than the picture of the single dramatic secret that the cover story's most reductive version would require. The reductive version would be the version of the cover story that was covering the Nazi SS Major Father, and only the Nazi SS Major Father, and the cover story would be the cover story of the palace that had approved the marriage with the knowledge of the SS Major Father, and that had concealed the knowledge of the SS Major Father until the Daily Mirror had found the Berlin Documentation Center files in 1985. The reductive version is accurate as far as it goes. The palace had found the SS files. The palace had approved the marriage. The palace had not disclosed the SS files. The Daily Mirror had found the SS files 7 years later. The palace had produced the 2 sentences about the confirmation and the total surprise. Philip Hall had said it struck him that someone was covering something up. Harold Brooks Baker had said they had certainly inquired and kept quiet for fear of a scandal. The cover story's SS dimension is the dimension that the available evidence has established most precisely, because the available evidence for this dimension is the evidence of the Berlin Documentation Center files and the palace's 1985 statement and the historian's subsequent assessments, and the precision of the evidence is the precision of the documented rather than the alleged. But the SS dimension is not the whole of what the cover story was covering. The whole of what the cover story was covering was the accumulation of the things that the 10 parts have assembled, and the accumulation was the accumulation of the SS files, and the £69 per week rent, and the £120,000 annual Queen's private provision, and the Princess Pushy manufacturing of the visibility, and the New York restaurant, and the Blackamoor brooch, and the Venus and Serena sheep, and the Putin sting, and the Kensington Palace backdrop for the $200,000 endorsement speech, and the wouldn't want the world to know formulation of the Marquis of Reading. Each of the things in the accumulation is the thing that the cover story was covering at the specific moment that the thing required the covering, and the accumulation of the things is the accumulation of the cover story's subjects across the 47 years of the marriage. The honest accounting of the accumulation requires the examination of whether the accumulation constitutes a cover story in the specific sense that the title's proposition requires, which is the sense of the coordinated institutional narrative that the palace had produced for the marriage's public presentation, and that the marriage's actual content had been requiring the palace to manage away from the public presentation across the 47 years of the management. The coordinated institutional narrative was the narrative of the not working royals who were managing without the public funding, and who were the Queen's first cousin, and his wife, and who were the people of the Central European aristocratic formation and the military career, and the books about European royalty, and the interior design, and the royal engagements at their own expense. The narrative was the cover story, in the sense that the narrative was the institutional production of the public presentation of the marriage, rather than the honest accounting of the marriage's specific content, and the specific content, the covering was not the covering of the single dramatic secret that the reductive version requires, but the covering of the accumulation of the specific things that each required the specific management at the specific moment, and the management of each was the management of the specific thing that the management required, rather than the management of a single coordinated conspiracy whose planning preceded the marriage and whose execution organized the 47 years. The distinction between the coordinated conspiracy and the accumulated management is the distinction that the honest accounting requires to be made, because the coordinated conspiracy is the cover story of the dramatic version, and the accumulated management is the cover story of the institutional version, and the two versions are different versions of the same evidence assembled in the different registers of the dramatic and the institutional. The institutional version is the version that the available evidence most precisely supports, because the available evidence is the evidence of the institution's management of each incident as the incident required the management, rather than the evidence of the institution's planning of the incident's management before the incidents had occurred. The institution managed the SS revelation with the two sentences about the confirmation and the total surprise. The institution managed the Kensington Palace finances with the explanation of the Queen's private provision in recognition of the royal engagements. The institution managed the racial incidents with the condolences and the deep regrets and the very sorry and distressed. The institution managed the Putin sting with the not a working member formulation and the no special relationship statement. The institution managed each of these with the specific management instrument that each required at the specific moment of the requiring, and the managing of each was the managing that the institution had always been organized around producing for the incidents that its members generated and that required the management. What the honest accounting also requires is the accounting of the thing that the cover story was not covering, which was the marriage itself. The marriage was not the cover story. The marriage was the thing that the cover story had been written to manage, and the managing had been the managing of the specific dimensions of the marriage that required the management, rather than the managing of the marriage as the fabrication that the cover story's most literal reading would require. The marriage was not a fabrication. It was a marriage of 47 years that the two people at its center had conducted in the specific form of the marriage of two people who had found in each other the specific combination of the needs and the capabilities that the finding of the right person produces in the people who find it. The evidence for the marriage's genuine dimension is the evidence of the 47 years and the two children and the grandchildren and the books and the interior design and the royal engagements and the Kensington Palace apartment and the staircase fall and the heart surgery and the stroke and the wheelchair and the December carol service attended without the wife because the wife was bedridden. The 47 years is the evidence of the duration that the fabrication does not produce, because the fabrication produces the duration of the fabrication's maintenance rather than the duration of the thing the fabrication is fabricating, and the maintenance of the fabrication across 47 years is the maintenance of a different character from the maintenance of the marriage across the same 47 years. She said, in an interview that the biographical record has preserved, in the form of the statement that the person who has been inside the marriage for the duration produces when they are asked about the marriage's character. I have always been interested in history and in the decorative arts and in the European dynasties, and Michael shares these interests, and the sharing of the interests is the sharing that the marriage has organized itself around across the years of the sharing. The sharing of the interests is not the dramatic statement of the passionate love that the romantic version of the marriage's honest accounting would require, but it is the statement of the thing that the 47 years of the marriage's duration produces in the people who have been inside it, as the honest accounting of what the inside has contained, which is the sharing of the interests and the formation and the social world and the institutional membership and the edge position and the cover stories management. The cover stories management was what they had shared, alongside the interests, and the formation, and the children, and the grandchildren. The cover stories management was the thing that the palace had written for the marriage, and that the marriage's 47 years had required the managing of, in the form of the SS revelation management, and the financial architecture, and the racial incidents, and the Putin sting, and the next generation, and the health dimension. The managing had been the managing that the institution and the two people inside the marriage had conducted together across the 47 years, and the together was the together of the cover story's title's proposition. The palace had written the cover story. The couple had performed it. The performing had required the managing of the specific dimensions of the cover story that each dimension's management required, and the managing had been the shared activity of the institution and the two people whose marriage the cover story was organized around managing in the direction of the institutional presentation rather than the honest accounting. The honest accounting was what this account has been producing across its 11 parts, and the honest accounting has produced the picture of the marriage that the cover story was not organized around producing, but that the accumulation of the things the cover story was managing had been building toward requiring. The picture is the picture of the Queen's first cousin and the SS Major's daughter, who had found in each other the specific combination of the edge position's requirements and the Central European aristocratic formation, and the manufactured visibility, and the Russian connections, and the Kensington Palace backdrop, and the 120,000 annual private provision, and the total surprise, and the Princess Pushy, and the wouldn't want the world to know, and the bedridden, and the wheelchair, and the 47 years of the marriage that the palace had written the cover story for, and that the two people inside the marriage had performed the cover story of, and that the honest accounting has been assembling the picture of across the 11 parts. The picture is not the cover story. The picture is what the cover story was covering, and what the cover story was covering was not the single dramatic secret, but the accumulation of the specific things that 47 years of the edge positions management of the institutional membership in the British royal family produces when. The management is the management of the institution that wrote the cover story, and the two people who performed it, and the things that the performing required the managing of, and the honest accounting that the managing was organized around not producing. The honest accounting is this account. The cover story is the palace's account. The two accounts of the same marriage are the two accounts of the same 47 years, and the 47 years contained both of them simultaneously, and the both of them simultaneously is the specific quality of the Kentz's marriage that the title's proposition was organized around establishing, and that the honest accounting has established in the form that the 11 parts have produced. The cover story ran for 47 years. The honest accounting has been running for 11 parts. The 11 parts are what remains when the cover story has been the cover story, and the honest accounting has been the honest accounting, and the both of them together are the picture of the marriage that the palace wrote the cover story for, and that the two people inside the marriage performed, and that the honest accounting has been producing across the parts that the honest accounting required. Queen Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September 2022 at Balmoral Castle, at the age of 96, and her death produced in the British royal family the specific institutional transformation that the death of the sovereign always produces, which was the transformation of the institution from the institution organized around the person of the sovereign, who had been the sovereign for 70 years, into the institution organized around the person of the sovereign who was now the sovereign and who had been the heir for 70 years, and who was therefore the person whose specific understanding of the institution's management was the understanding of the person who had been managing the understanding of the institution for the entirety of the period during which the institution had been the institution that the preceding sovereign had organized. Charles III's understanding of the institution was the understanding of the 70 years of the heir's observation of the institution's management and the specific assessments of the institution's management that the 70 years of observation had produced in the person who was now the institution's head. The assessments were the assessments of someone who had been watching the institution manage the things it was required to manage across 70 years of the management, and who had formed, from the watching, the specific conclusions about what the management had been managing well and what the management had been managing in the direction of the managed rather than the addressed. The Kents were in the category of the managed rather than the addressed. The managed rather than the addressed was the category that the Queen's specific relationship to Prince Michael had produced as the category of the management. Because the Queen's relationship to Prince Michael was the relationship of the first cousin, whose page boy at the 1947 wedding had been the 5-year-old Michael, and whose 75-year relationship with Michael had produced the specific quality of the management that the relationship of the first cousin and the page boy generates when the page boy has grown into the cover story's principal male subject. The Queen had managed the Kents in the direction of the managed rather than the addressed across the 44 years between the Vienna ceremony of 1978 and her death in September 2022, and the managing had been the managing of the SS revelation and the financial architecture and the racial incidents and the Putin sting and the cover story's various dimensions in the specific form of the private provision and the deep sadness statement and the not a working member formulation and the total surprise and the shock. The managing had been thorough. The managing had also been the managing of the first cousin's relationship rather than the institutional head's relationship to the institutional member whose membership was producing the management requirements. And the distinction between the first cousin's management and the institutional head's management was the distinction that the Queen's relationship to Michael had not always clearly maintained. The not always clearly maintained was the dimension of the management that Charles had been observing across the 70 years, and that Charles's assessments had produced the specific conclusions about, and the conclusions were the conclusions of the institutional head's assessment of the institution's management of the peripheral members whose management the first cousin's relationship had been organizing in the direction of the private provision and the accommodation rather than the institutional address. The address was what Charles's management of the Kents, after September 2022, was organized around producing in the place of the accommodation that the Queen's management had been organized around producing. The address took specific forms. The financial architecture's continuation in the form of the King's private provision of the £120,000 annual commercial rate from his own private funds was the continuation that Charles had inherited from the Queen, and that he was continuing in the form of the continued accommodation rather than the institutional address. Because the institutional address would have required the reform that the Public Accounts Committee had recommended in 2002, and that the Queen's explanation, rather than reform, had prevented from being the reform that the committee had recommended. The continuation was the continuation of the accommodation in the form that the accommodation's maintenance required when the sovereign who had been providing it had been replaced by the sovereign who was continuing it. But the address was also present in the specific forms that Charles's management of the peripheral members had been taking since the Queen's death, and the forms were the forms that the institutional head's assessment of the institution's management requirements produced when the assessment had concluded that the accommodation had been producing the management costs that the address would have prevented. The address was the address of the institution that was managing its peripheral members in the direction of the cleaner distinction between the working royal and the not working royal than the Queen's management of the distinction had maintained. The cleaner distinction was the distinction that Charles had been working toward in his management of the institution since the accession, and the working toward was the working toward of the person who had concluded from the 70 years of observation that the blurred distinction between the working royal and the not working royal was the blurred distinction that had produced the management costs of the accommodation, and that the cleaner distinction would produce the management costs of the address rather than the accommodation, and the address's management costs were the costs of the explicit statement of the distinction rather than the implicit management of the blurring. The explicit statement of the distinction had been the statement that Charles had been making in the specific institutional actions that he had taken since the accession in the direction of the smaller working royal family, and the cleaner distinction between the institutional members who were performing the institutional functions and the institutional members who were the peripheral members of the institution's extended family, rather than the performing members of the institution's operational core. The smaller working royal family was the institutional configuration that the address's management costs were organized around producing, and the Kents were the members of the extended family, whose position in the smaller working royal family's configuration was the position of the peripheral rather than the operational. The peripheral rather than the operational was the position that the Kents had always occupied, which was the position that the cover story had been managing across the 47 years of the cover story's operation. What Charles's management of the peripheral rather than the operational had changed was not the position itself, because the position had always been the peripheral rather than the operational, but the institutional management of the position in the direction of the explicit rather than the managed implicit that the Queen's first cousin relationship had organized the management around. The explicit rather than the managed implicit was the institutional statement of the distinction between the working royal and the not working royal, in the form that the explicit statement required, rather than the form of the private provision and the explanation and the continuation that the managed implicit had been producing. The managed implicit was the cover story's financial dimension. The explicit was the institutional statement of the distinction. The distinction between the managed implicit and the explicit was the distinction between the Queen's management of the Kents and Charles's management of the Kents, and the distinction was the distinction that the 47 years of the cover story's operation and the Queen's death and the accession of the person who had been observing the management for 70 years had produced as the available distinction in the management of the peripheral member's cover story. But the explicit also had its limits. The explicit required the addressing of the things that the explicit statement of the distinction required to be addressed, and the addressing of the things included the addressing of the financial architecture whose reform the Public Accounts Committee had recommended in 2002, and that the Queen's explanation, rather than reform, had prevented. The reform of the financial architecture was the reform that the explicit statement of the distinction between the working royal and the not working royal required if the distinction was to be the clean distinction rather than the blurred one, and the reform had not been produced in the form of the explicit statements addressing of the architecture in the time between the Queen's death and the point of this accounts assembly. The reform had not been produced because the reform required the producing of the explicit statement in the form of the statement that the accommodation's continuation was not the continuation of the reformed arrangement, but the continuation of the explained, rather than reformed arrangement, that the committee's recommendation had produced, and that the Queen's continuation had maintained, and that Charles's continuation was maintaining. The maintaining was the maintaining that the explicit statement of the distinction had not yet converted into the reform that the explicit statement would require, if the explicit statement was the explicit statement of the clean distinction, rather than the managed implicit's continuation, in the form of the explicit, rather than the implicit. The cover story's financial dimension was still the cover story's financial dimension. The cover story's management had changed in the form of the Queen's management to Charles's management, and the changing had been the changing of the first cousin's management to the institutional head's management that the accession had produced. But the cover story was still the cover story, and the financial architecture was still the financial architecture, and the Kensington Palace apartment was still the Kensington Palace apartment, and the commercial rate was still the commercial rate that the King's private funds were providing in the place of the Queen's private funds that had been providing it. The cover story's continuation after the Queen's death was the continuation in the form of the new sovereign's management of the cover story that the previous sovereign had written, and that the new sovereign had inherited alongside the throne and the crown, and the institutional management of the British monarchy. The inheritance was the inheritance of the management of all of it, including the Kents, and the management of the Kents was the management of the cover story that the palace had written, together with the Kents' marriage in 1978, and that the 47 years had been managing in the direction of the accommodation, and the explanation, and the continuation. The continuation after September 2022 was the continuation of someone who had a different management style and a different institutional vision and a different relationship to the peripheral member than the Queen's first cousin relationship had produced in the 67 years of the Queen's management of Prince Michael. But the continuation was still the continuation of the cover story's management, rather than the cover story's ending, because the ending of the cover story was the ending that the reform would produce, and the reform had not been produced. The cover story was still running. The sovereign who had inherited it was the sovereign who had been observing the management of it for 70 years. The observing had produced the assessments. The assessments had produced the specific management of the peripheral members in the direction of the smaller working royal family. The smaller working royal family's configuration had not eliminated the cover story. It had continued the cover story in the specific form of the institutional head's management, rather than the first cousin's management. The difference was the difference between the first cousin and the institutional head. Both were managing the cover story. The cover story was the same cover story. The question that the 47 years of the Kents' marriage and its management produces. When the management is examined with the attention that the honest accounting of the management requires, rather than the attention that the cover story's management of the management has organized the available attention around, is the question of whether the cover story served the institution that produced it or damaged the institution that produced it, and the examination of the question requires the examination of the specific mechanism of the cover story as the institutional management tool, rather than the examination of the specific contents of the cover story that the preceding 12 parts have been assembling from the available evidence. The mechanism of the cover story as the institutional management tool is the mechanism of the narrative production that the institution deploys when the available material requires the institutional narrative to organize the available material in the direction of the institutional presentation rather than the honest accounting. The institutional presentation is the presentation of the institution's public image in the form that the public image requires to maintain the institutional legitimacy that the public image's maintenance is organized around producing, and the honest accounting is the accounting of the institution's actual management of the available material in the form that the actual management produces when the actual management is the management of the accumulated rather than the single dramatic event. The available material that the cover story was organized around managing was the accumulated material of the SS files, and the Catholic faith, and the succession rights, and the £69 per week, and the Princess Pushy, and the New York restaurant, and the Blackamoor brooch, and the Venus and Serena sheep, and the Putin sting, and the next generation, and the health dimension. And the accumulation was the accumulation that 47 years of the edge positions management had produced from the marriage that the palace had approved in 1978, with the knowledge of the SS files and the management decision to approve the marriage despite the SS files. The management decision to approve the marriage despite the SS files was the original institutional decision from which the subsequent decades of the cover story's management had followed as the necessary consequence of the original decision. Because the original decision had been the decision that required the cover story's production as the narrative that managed the original decision's specific implications for the institutional presentation. The original decision's implications were the implications of the institution that had approved the marriage of the Queen's first cousin to the daughter of the SS Major, with the knowledge of the SS Major's specific history, and the implications were the implications that the institutional presentation required to be managed in the direction of the not presented rather than the presented. The counterfactual is the examination that the original decision requires when the honest accounting of the original decision is the accounting that the honest accounting produces rather than the accounting that the institutional presentation requires. The counterfactual is the examination of what would have happened if the palace had been transparent in 1978 about the SS files and the Catholic faith and the succession rights, and the specific combination of the background information that the vetting had produced about the person that Prince Michael of Kent wanted to marry. The transparent account in 1978 would have required the palace to produce the statement that established the specific contents of the background information in the form that the background information's honest presentation required, which was the statement that Prince Michael of Kent was seeking the Queen's permission to marry a woman whose father had been an SS Major, who had joined the Nazi Party in 1930 and the SS in 1933 on the recommendation of Hermann Göring, and who had risen to the rank of Major before being dismissed for declaring his Catholicism over his SS membership, and that the palace had examined this information and had concluded that the marriage should be approved despite the information for the following reasons. The following reasons would have been the reasons that the institutional decision had actually been organized around, which were the reasons of the peripheral royal's need for the institutional stability of the marriage, and the specific combination of the available bride's formation and the social intelligence and the physical presence that made her the person that the institutional decision's approval had concluded was the appropriate person for the institutional approval, despite the background that the approval required to be approved despite. The transparent account would have been the account of the institution's actual decision-making rather than the cover story's management of the decision-making in the direction of the not presented. The transparent account would have produced the coverage that the transparent account's production generates, when the transparent account is the account of the institution's approval of the marriage of the Queen's first cousin to the daughter of the SS Major. The coverage would have been the 1978 coverage rather than the 1985 coverage, and the 1978 coverage would have been the coverage of the institutional decision rather than the coverage of the Daily Mirror's discovery of the institutional decision's concealment. The distinction between the 1978 coverage of the decision and the 1985 coverage of the concealment is the distinction that the cover story had been organized around producing rather than eliminating, because the cover story's production had been the production of the management that converted the 1978 coverage of the decision into the 1985 coverage of the concealment. The 1985 coverage of the concealment was more damaging than the 1978 coverage of the decision would have been. This is the specific institutional lesson that the cover story's management of the SS files produces when the honest accounting of the management is the accounting that the accounting requires, rather than the accounting that the cover story had been organized around producing. The 1985 coverage was more damaging because the 1985 coverage was the coverage of the two things simultaneously, which were the SS Major Father and the palace's management of the SS Major Father's information in the direction of the concealment, and the two things together were the two things that the coverage of the concealed produced, rather than the single thing that the coverage of the disclosed would have produced. The concealment's coverage was the coverage of the institution that had decided the information required concealment rather than disclosure, and the institution that had decided the information required concealment was the institution whose decision to conceal was the decision that the covering up was covering up, rather than the information that the covering up had been organized around covering. Philip Hall had said it struck him that someone was covering something up, and the someone was the institution, and the covering up was the covering up of the SS files, and the struck him was the struck him of the person who had understood that the covering up was the more institutionally significant discovery than the SS files that the covering up had been covering. The institution had learned from the 1985 revelation the specific lesson that the revelation of the cover story produces in the institution that has been operating the cover story, which was the lesson of the cover story's management cost. The management cost of the cover story is the cost of the cover story's continuation after the revelation has converted the private management into the public management, and the public management is the management of the institution that must now manage the information in the form of the public record rather than the private file. And the management of the information in the form of the public record is the management whose costs are higher than the management of the information in the form of the private file, because the public record requires the institutional responses to the public's engagement with the record that the private file's management does not require. The institutional responses to the public's engagement with the record were the responses of the subsequent decades after 1985, which were the responses of the deep regret and the very sorry and distressed, and the no special relationship, and the not a working member, and the deep sadness of the palace's statements, and the institutional management of each subsequent incident that the cover story's continuation had required the managing of. The responses were the management costs of the cover story's revelation, and the management costs were the costs that the transparent account in 1978 would not have generated, because the transparent account would not have produced the cover story whose revelation generated the management costs. The institution's lesson was the lesson that the transparent account in 1978 would have been the less costly institutional management of the available material than the cover story that had produced the 1985 revelation and the subsequent decades of the management costs. But the institution's learning of the lesson did not require the lesson to have been learned in time to prevent the cover story, because the lesson's learning is the learning that the institution produces from the specific instance of the management cost, rather than the learning that the institution had available before the specific instance produced the management cost. The learning was the learning of the institution that had managed the cover story for 47 years, and that had produced from the 47 years the specific understanding of what the cover story had cost, and what the transparent account might have prevented. What the transparent account might have prevented was not the marriage. The marriage was the thing that the institution had concluded was the appropriate thing to approve, and the approval had been the institutional decision that the transparent account would have disclosed rather than concealed. The transparent account would have prevented the concealment's cost rather than the marriage's cost, and the concealment's cost was the cost of the 7 years of the private management of the SS files, and the 1985 revelation, and the 2 sentences about the confirmation and the total surprise, and the Philip Hall observation about the covering up, and the Harold Brooks Baker observation about the certainly inquired and kept quiet. The concealment's cost was also the cost of the cover story's continuation in the subsequent decades, and the continuation's costs were the costs of the managed implicit financial architecture, and the Princess Pushy manufacturing, and the racial incidents management, and the Putin stings management, and the not a working member formulation, and the wouldn't want the world to know, and the deep sadness statements, and the 47 years of the institutional management of the edge positions cover story in the form of the management of the thing that the transparent account would have disclosed rather than managed. The 47 years of the management was the cost. The transparent account would have been the disclosure. The disclosure would have been the 1978 coverage rather than the 1985 concealment's revelation and the subsequent decades' management costs. The institution's lesson from the 47 years was the lesson that the transparent accounts coverage was the coverage whose management cost was the lower cost, and the lower cost was the cost of the single disclosure rather than the cost of the disclosure plus the concealment, plus the revelation, plus the subsequent decades of the management of the revealed concealment. The institution was not organized to have learned the lesson before the cover story had been the cover story for 47 years. The institution is organized around the management of the available material in the direction of the institutional presentation, rather than the honest accounting, and the management of the available material in that direction is the management that produces the cover story as the institutional management tool, rather than the transparent account as the institutional management tool. The transparent account requires the institution to conclude that the honest accounting's cost is lower than the cover story's cost, and the conclusion requires the institution to have the evidence of the cover story's cost before the conclusion can be the conclusion that the evidence supports. The evidence was the 47 years. The 47 years was the evidence. The evidence produced the lesson. The lesson was the lesson of the cover story's cost and the transparent account's lower cost. The institution had learned the lesson from the 47 years of the Kents's marriage that the palace had written the cover story for, and that the cover story had been managing across. The managing was the 47 years. The lesson was the lesson, and the lesson's application to the institution's subsequent management of the peripheral members was the application that the following and final part of this account examines. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next one.